Hi, everyone. We are very excited to be here. Rosa is going to talk to us about representations. And before John introduces Rosa, I'm just going to remind everyone who's new here that the Learning Salon is a weekly interdisciplinary forum in which we discuss bridges and contentions between biological and artificial learning. It's a very interdisciplinary salon. And so if you have any questions and something in a different discipline is not familiar to you, feel free to ask a clarification question in the chat. And if you have a question that you'd like to ask the speaker, please ask it in the Ask a Question area and vote on each other's questions. Depending on the flow of the discussion, we might invite some folks on screen, or just say, ask for me if you don't want to come on screen, or if your tech is not sort of camera ready today. So a number of things. Please remember that disagreements are welcome, especially today, which is a topic that has been kind of hot recently. So I think that there's going to be some disagreements, but respect is very important, and an attempt towards understanding and an attempt towards understanding the other side, and then expressing our opinions and making the other side understand one's sort of points is important. So try to listen to everybody's points, just to make sure that there is a collective effort together towards some kind of understanding. Especially if you are a junior member, we encourage you to ask questions either in the chat for clarification or in the Ask a Question area. As you know, a lot of different disciplines are around here, so no question is really not good enough. If you have anything on your mind that makes it impossible or difficult to follow, please do feel free to ask. And we'd like to thank again Claire, who is behind the scene, and Bahar. And we would like to welcome again Jovo, who hasn't been around for a couple of weeks, who has returned and has lost the rest of his hair. So that's another new development at the salon. And yeah, so welcome, Jovo. And John, please go ahead and feel free to introduce Rosa. And please fill in if I forgot to mention anything.
You know, listening to what you just said, Ida, I realized we missed out on a joke. I wish I was here with some dreads. You know, it would have been great, but I didn't think of it. We transferred hair. So, you know, it's really exciting to have Rosa on. It's interesting that we've had a number of people now, including, of course, Ida, who also has a degree in philosophy of science. We've had some real sort of double threats. We've had Mazrita Chirimuta, who also had a PhD in neuroscience and then a PhD in philosophy. David Barak was on, who has a PhD in philosophy and PhD in neuroscience. And now Rosa, who did a PhD first in neuroscience at MIT, and then a PhD in philosophy at NYU. So I think it's incredibly rich and great for the field that that there are people who are coming with both viewpoints and bringing them and integrating them really usefully. And I think it's one of the big pluses, I think, of the Salon, that we've been able to sort of promote that dialogue and have people who are in fact living it. So I actually heard Rosa speak and heard about her quite recently because of her beautiful work that she did with Dan Yeamans, where they really tried to discuss the notion, I think, more in those papers of sort of, can we get a mechanistic view of the brain, but be a little bit more coarse-grained than neurons and their connections. And I think those papers are extremely valuable because it can show you, and I agree, that there are useful ways of thinking mechanistically which will allow for some abstraction. And the way they talk about it, which I think is really lovely, is that Rosa talks about the fact that, you know, no two monkeys are the same in terms of their presumably neuron number and their connections, and yet you have invariance that you assume by induction it applies across the ventral stream. So in other words, it's implying almost that there's some kind of abstraction. And now, you know, I think what we're going to hear about today from Rosa is about views about representation, which I think we knew were coming based on the conversations that were leading up to this. And I do think it's a very valuable conversation. I think Ida's absolutely right. We really need to have this conversation. It's not about being dogmatic, it's about really trying to hash things out. I think it's particularly apropos because it came up in a huge tweet storm that's going on right now based on an article that I was interviewed for by Ed Yong on a paper called Representational Drift, where the term representation in that title was precisely what I disagree with, actually. And it led to all sorts of back and forth, meaning that this isn't a stale debate, actually. It's something that we need to care about, because the paper can be seen either as a surprise or not a surprise, depending on the kind of framework that you have with respect to the notion of representation, right? So in other words, it's half empty, half full kind of situation with respect to how surprised one should be with respect to certain neuroscience results. So I think that conversation about representation matters. It's not just terminology, it's not just semantics, it's not just philosophy versus neuroscience. It's a real issue that will probably need to be discussed from all sides. And so it's extremely exciting to have Rosa come and talk about that, because if it's anything like the work she's already done, I find that it's always highly informative, and that's been the response to you, by the way, Rosa, both in the chat and from us as hosts and others, that your contribution has been really welcome in the Salon. So it's great to have you get your own spot. So welcome.
So thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to hear what people say about representation, since we always seem to end up talking about it. So let me just share my screen. Okay, you guys see?
Perfectly, yeah.
Okay. So I don't think I need to tell anyone here that representations are this kind of central concept in neuroscience, and also more broadly. So, the brain deals in representations of the world. It seems like we access these representations as scientists by looking at patterns of neural activity. It's also kind of central to our everyday understanding of ourselves and how we interact with each other. So when we talk about our thoughts or memories or desires or beliefs, those are all representations as well. And you might think representations are plausibly one thing that makes mind special. It's what allows us to be intelligent. It's what makes the brain extra interesting to study. And you might also think that part of the promise of neuroscience is that brain activity, these representations in the brain that it seems like we can measure with our ordinary scientific instruments, can explain all these sort of high-level personal goodies that had been mysterious for millennia, things like thought and intelligence and experience. And maybe in artificial intelligence, if we find the right representations, that will help us recreate and improve on our own mental capacities. So representations seem like this really fruitful area of study. On the other hand, they're also kind of controversial. So so they're kind of controversial because you might worry that we're taking the notion of representation too seriously, or maybe we don't know exactly what we're talking about. So you might be in a camp that's kind of worried about representation talk because it's kind of fuzzy. Maybe if you're a philosopher, you worry that there's no naturalistically respectable notion that can do the job. Maybe if you're a neuroscientist, you think we can actually get along without this fuzzier notion, and everything that really matters about the brain and behavior could, in principle, be explained in non-representational terms. Or you might think that it's a super useful concept that's totally unproblematic and feel perfectly comfortable with using it everywhere because we all do know what we mean. I think there probably are some people who think this, but I'm not as sure about that because it seems like miscommunication and misunderstanding does happen when we use the word representation. But I'd be really interested to hear what people think is the unproblematic notion. And I think maybe Ida will say something about this later. So one reason to doubt that a simple uncontroversial notion exists is that you can't really just look in the brain and measure representations the way that you can sort of see neurons under a microscope or measure spikes with your electrode. And you definitely can't see what the representations are about, right? Like that's not something that's immediately apparent to our ordinary measuring instruments. We somehow have to do more work to infer the representational content of things that we find in the brain. So that's a reason to be worried about the concept. On the other hand, if we were to eliminate representation talk, it seems like we'd lose something really valuable, like a way to track real patterns and real correlations between brain and behavior that we care about, and a way of answering explanatory questions. So what are we supposed to do here, right? How do we answer this question of how seriously we should take the notion and what the most useful, helpful notion is? So I'll try to say something more about that, but just to get us started, I wanted to give some examples of representations and how they're related to things that we might be interested in explaining. So you have things like alarm calls, which are like external representations, right? They're not inside the brain. They're sounds, they're calls that animals make that elicit behaviors from other animals. You also have representations that humans use, things like maps, again, external representations. You have sort of a paradigm early example of an internal representation in the pattern of neural firing inside a frog's visual areas. And then you have this sort of more everyday notion of representation. So here you have a picture of, I think, purportedly Aristotle thinking about Fodor's cat, gray cat. And what all of these phenomena are supposed to have in common is that they involve representations. They're all representational, even though they're quite different in a bunch of other ways, right? So the vervet monkey's eagle alarm is supposed to represent the eagle. The neural spiking patterns in the frog are supposed to represent the fly. The external map on my screen represents a piece of Stanford's campus, and Aristotle's thoughts are supposed to represent gray cat with a ball. So those are what we might call the contents of the representations, or what they're about. And when we talk about representations, sometimes we're talking about the contents, but sometimes we're talking about the vehicles. So I just want to make that distinction clear. The vehicle of a representation is the physical thing that actually does the relevant job, right? Whether it's neural spikes or a piece of paper or a pattern of sound waves in the air, those are the vehicles of the representation, whereas the contents are what the representations are about. And so, we have the sort of diversity of applications of the notion of representation. And you might ask, like, what good is the notion of representation doing for us in describing these different situations? It seems like it's really important, because if we weren't able to use the word representation, or if we weren't able to use the concept representation, we'd be missing something in what's going on in each of these situations. We'd be unable to describe what was really happening there. And we might also think that we'd be unable to answer certain kinds of useful questions, like how does the frog catch the fly? Or how did I not get lost going to my office, in those long ago days when I actually went to my office? So it's important for describing the phenomena that we care about. But it's also really mysterious in another way, right? Because it's not totally clear what it is about the particular configuration inside Aristotle's brain that makes it true that he's thinking about gray cat with a ball, and not, say, how many teeth his wife has, right? It's not totally obvious why the particular pattern of neural activity that you find in a frog should be aimed at telling the frog where the fly is and where to stick its tongue, rather than something else. So that's kind of a first pass at why we might care about representation and what some of the key questions about it are. So here's sort of my summary of some different notions of representation that seem to be in common use. And while they have something in common, as was shown on the previous slide, they're not exactly the same, right? So on the one hand, you have something like person level thoughts, like mental representations, experiences, things that are introspectively accessible to us. On the other hand, you have sort of patterns of neural activity that we don't have personal access to. We can only see those by, putting someone in a scanner or sticking electrodes in their brain. And then you have this third notion of representation, which I think is maybe more common in AI and in computer science, where the representation is something more like a scheme for mapping a class of contents to a corresponding class of physical or syntactic configurations, right? And that seems less like a particular token thing and more like a way of organizing information. And it's really not clear to me how these different notions are supposed to interact with each other. And that's something that I'd really like to get more clear on. What I do think we can say is that you can sort of sort the different explanatory roles of representation into two main classes. So the first class is a kind of top-down explanatory role, where they're really playing the role of explananda, like the thing we don't understand, the target of explanation, the thing that we want to try to understand. So, for example, introspectively accessible mental states, like our thoughts, our memories, and so on, those are the things that we want to try to explain using neuroscience. And you might also think that there's a characterization of, there are certain complex behaviors and capacities that we have that seem to necessitate a kind of representation. And so we use representation to talk about those particular capacities. So one example of this that Charles Gellistel really likes is the example of navigation. You might think that the complexity of the behavior exhibited by certain kinds of creatures in their abilities to navigate mean that they have to be using representations. There have to be representations in there in order for them to be producing this behavior. So representations are kind of assumed from the beginning. They're not something that we find experimentally. They're something that we know a priori has to be there based on the description of the phenomenon. The second class of explanatory roles that representations play are what I think of as bottom-up explanatory roles. So there we're thinking more about, wiring connection facts is how Peter Godfrey Smith puts it. But it's basically what I think experimental neuroscientists tend to be more concerned with. So things like the internal physiology of organisms in their brains and how those are connected to environmental facts and the interesting behaviors that those creatures exhibit. And because those facts are so many and so complicated, we need some way to make them more cognitively tractable to us as scientists. And so representation talk is a way of making sense of these innumerable and complex wiring and connection facts. And they're a way of letting us compress maybe otherwise unwieldy bodies of information. But in these cases, the explanatory role of representation is to help us. They're part of the explanans. They're kind of explanatory resources that we appeal to in trying to give an explanation of the complex things, of the things like behavior, or of the things like experience. So these are two quite distinct roles that representations are supposed to play. And I think it would be a mistake to equivocate between these two roles. So one thing that I think happens when we don't make a clear distinction between these different ways in which representation is used is that you might think that in virtue of finding a neural representation of something, you've explained a mental representation of that same thing, right? So you might think that by finding the neural correlate of, say, a visual experience, you've fully explained that visual experience. Whereas I think some philosophers would tend to say that's not yet an explanation. You found a correlation, but the fact that you use the same word, representation, to describe both your visual experience of something and the thing that your brain does when you look at that thing is not yet a full explanation of your experience. I think that generalizes to things outside of perception. Should I wrap up, or are there? How much time do I have?
Oh, please go ahead.
I think that last point was really great. How many more minutes do you think you need, Rosa?
I would like 10 more, but
sure, go ahead. I would say let's go ahead.
Go ahead. Go
okay.
ahead. Yeah, I agree with Ida.
Okay, so now I'm just going to say very quickly the kinds of things that I think we actually see neuroscientists doing, and try to draw some quick lessons from that. So one thing that we tend to look at is something like neural tuning, right? Like, what stimuli do neurons prefer to respond to? What do they respond to most strongly? I think everyone's familiar with this approach from textbooks, and on the basis of this kind of reasoning, people commonly assign representational contents to cells and groups of cells in different parts of the brain. For example, we talk about face-selective regions as representing faces. We talk about things outside of perceptual areas, like place cells represent places, engrams represent episodic memories, firing of dopamine neurons represents reward prediction error. These are all sort of classic examples of representational attributions that are made. And at this point, you might be nodding along. You might think, yeah, these are platitudes in neuroscience. These are things that we are confident of, even if there are many things that we don't understand about the brain. Or you might be getting kind of upset, right? Like you might be thinking, no, all that those things have in common with representations is that they're correlated with the things that they're supposed to represent. Maybe they're causally hooked up to the things that they represent, but we don't yet know that they really represent them, right? Because representations are not just causal intermediaries between stimulus and behavior. They're sort of supposed to play a kind of distinctive role, right? Representations are supposed to be aimed at something. They're supposed to be about something. And it doesn't seem like in just measuring what a cell responds to, we've yet determined what that neural activity is supposed to represent or what its function is. It seems like function is, again, one of these things that it's quite hard to get epistemic access to, right? You can look at neurons under a microscope, you can record spikes, but it's very hard to see what the function of some part of the brain is, right? You can sort of guess that whatever the brain is doing is what it was intended to do, what it's supposed to do, maybe as a consequence of evolution or as a consequence of learning, but it's not something that you can see directly. And so then there's a question, given that you can't see it directly, how do we determine what the function is? Because the function is going to be the thing that tells us what's supposed to be represented. And the function is going to tell us whether the activity in some part of a brain is representational at all, as opposed to just, doing some non-representational biological stuff, which you might think lots of the brain is doing all the time anyway. Okay, I think there are some pragmatic responses to these worries. So you might think, okay, it's true that we have no, inside line. We have no God's eye view on what the function of various parts of the brain are. But we know that we're interested in explaining particular behaviors and capacities. And so in the context of trying to explain a particular behavior or a particular capacity, we should just presume that the function of the parts of the brain that are causally involved in producing that behavior do have the function to produce that behavior. So we're kind of, as scientists and observers, stipulating a function for that part of the brain for the purposes of that investigation. And that function is just given by the task or capacity we're interested in explaining. And then once we have that function, which we've stipulated, then we can say, well, what makes some neural patterns or some things in the brain that are happening representational is that they are levers for intervening on the phenomena of interest, right? They are ways that we can manipulate the phenomenon that we're interested in studying, and hopefully ways that we can intervene on the phenomena in virtue of the ascribed content of these levers. So if we want an account of representation for neuroscience, I think it should give us a couple of things. It should tell us what to look for in the brain when we posit that a representation exists. And it should also be the case that if we're looking at the brain and we observe some patterns of activity, the account of representation should tell us how to interpret that pattern of activity, right? How it should tell us something about how to guess what it's supposed to be about. And finally, it should tell us how to resolve disagreements about what's being represented. And if we can't resolve the disagreement, it should tell us why we can't resolve the disagreement. Okay, is it possible to get all of these things that we want? I think it's going to be kind of hard, right? Because this presumes a kind of realism about representations where they're really out there and like we just have to figure out the right way to pick them out. And I think that might be asking for something that isn't really there, because if you think about, how we figure out what's going on in the brain, it's always very indirectly, right? It's always via some kind of instrument. So here you have like a single electrode. You could have much more sophisticated electrodes that allow you to record much more neural activity. But again, you're always just recording neural activity in the presence of some kind of stimulus. You're recording neural activity that precedes some kind of motor output, but you don't yet have an interpretation of what that neural activity is for, right? It doesn't seem like the data alone will tell you how to interpret them. They're not going to be self-interpreting. You need some further framework. So, for example, fMRI is another kind of probe. where you can measure various kinds of neural activity, but then it's up to us to assign the interpretation. So how do we in fact assign interpretations to these things? Well, I think you can see that different kinds of probes, depending on how you measure the brain, are going to illuminate different aspects of the internal functional structure of the system. And so what we should really say is something like, it's probe relative what representations we detect in the brain, right? It's not going to be the case that there is a single matter of fact about what a particular pattern of activity in the brain represents. Rather, it's going to depend on what we're interested in and what probe we're using to measure it. I'm going to skip this one. And the point here is kind of an old one, but I think it was popularized by Daniel Dennett. So the thought is something like 2 or more conflicting interpretations can often be placed on the same data. And there isn't going to be a fact of the matter about what's really there, because all we mean by there really being a pattern in the data is for there to be some mechanism with the ability to consistently discern that pattern. And Dennett was talking about patterns, and he was talking about our interpretive practices in trying to attribute beliefs and desires to other humans in our everyday lives. But I think the same principle works when we're thinking about how we attribute representational content to things in the brain. There are going to be different interpretations available depending on what probe we're using and what interests we have in trying to explain things. So the patterns that we find, the patterns of activity that we find in the brain are going to be relative to probes, and so are the representational contents that we attribute. So what you find is going to depend on how you look, and you might wonder whether this is virtue or vice. So I'm just going to say one more thing and wrap up. I think it's going to be a vice in the sense that you don't get what you really wanted, which was like this fully objective, industrial strength, realist story about what the representations are and what the criteria for finding them are. Instead, you're going to get something that's a little more squishy. It's going to be relative to a scientific's interests, and it's going to be representations for a user relative to a probe, useful in a particular way to downstream parts of the system. And I think that's not as bad as it might initially sound, because we have pretty good diagnostics for how useful different probes are going to be, right? If they're manipulable, if we can deploy them in other contexts, then those are the probes that are going to pick out patterns that are actually useful for attributing representational content to. And I think, as with everything else in science, the sort of validation of any representational attribution is going to be in how good the predictions that it makes are, like how well the theory fits together with all the evidence that we have as a whole. So I think this is sort of the proposal that I have that lets us sort of do both of the things that we want. If you can be a kind of pragmatist about representation, then you can have both the sort of explanatory usefulness of representations without having to get into fights about whether a representation is really there, or whether probes in, you don't have to get into fights about whether representations are really there, but you can still be consistent about which things you want to call representations. So it's going to be the case that by making it explicit that your representation is relative to a probe, you get to avoid the kinds of miscommunication or equivocation that I started out the talk by saying were problems in neuroscience. It's going to be more, by making it explicit that you're always talking about representation relative to a probe, you can be careful. It can help you avoid attributing representational contents across different explanatory contexts or across different probes. And so it makes the language more precise in a way that I think will help avoid confusion. But I'd be curious what other people think. So I think that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rosa. Thank you so much. And so just a reminder to everyone, the three of us will ask a few questions. Please add your questions in the Ask a Question area and vote on each other's question. and mention if you would like your question to be asked, or otherwise we will maybe invite you to the screen. John, would you like to go first?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thanks, Rosa. That was really great. And I think your distinction between representations as explainans and explainander was really interesting. I think that's exactly right, that they're not the same thing. I also think your point about, look, if twos correlate, they can't be identity, right? If they're the same thing, that's not so interesting. So what I wanted to discuss is there are three.
Sorry, Rosa, do you mind muting yourself? There's an echo.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Thanks.
I'm actually going to put in the chat a review I just was asked to write for Nick Shay's book, which I think was in your reading list, right, Rosa? Is that correct? Yeah. It's really interesting that there seems to be a tripartite structure to this, right? One is, as you said, we don't want to use the word representation when we don't have to, right, in neuroscience. And, William Ramsey has a wonderful example of the bullet in the gun barrel, right? How does the pulling back the trigger of the rifle lead the bullet to go out the end? And you don't have to say that the barrel represents the width of the bullet and things like that. You don't need to use representational language when you can just have a causal sequential chain will suffice, right? You don't, in my view, have to invoke representation for the stretch reflex, for example. Now, if you read papers, philosophers like Gualtiero, Piccinini, Nick Shay, and others, they do start with subpersonal notions of representation. You had, I think, one there in your list. They'll say that you can say that the hand representation in motor cortex, that there's a hand representation there, that an object is represented in the ventral stream. And actually, I think Gualtiero has a whole paper wanting to naturalize representation. In other words, it gets back to the other main point you're making, is that they've got this slightly fluffy, abstract quality to them, and there's an attempt, I think, to go subpersonal to try and what we call naturalize or ground the notion in real things. So that was the subpersonal notion. There is a hand representation in motor cortex. There is a face representation in S1. There is an object representation in the ventral stream, saying those are as real as neurons, right? So that's the sort of, and Nick Shay very much likes, and then of course, as we've discussed before, Nick talks a lot about these intermediary flexible states in between a stimulus and a response, which goes beyond a whole sequence of parallel causal chains. You've got some kind of processed internal representation that allows there to be flexibility between inputs and outputs. And he uses the word representation for those, right? And it's the telesemantic account, right? The functional evolutionary account. Then there's the third one, which is the one that I feel is going to need extra sauce, which is when it comes to mental representations, right? When it comes to cognition. In other words, I don't believe what Gualtiero and Piccinini and others say, which is, and Nick say that whatever representation has in M1 or S1, that's going to be the same account that you can use for prefrontal cortex, let's say, right? And it's when you start talking about what, Grice called non-natural semantics, non-natural representations, managing to invoke fictional characters, fictional places. I'm picturing a unicorn right now for pride, right? Something like that. So I think the real question is, and I'm in agreement with everything that you're implying, is do you think that the attempt to naturalize representation subpersonally in primary modality, sensory and motor cortices, like some people do, is going to work when it comes to these, as you were saying, very overt, mentalistic representations. Is there going to have to be a qualitative change in the richness of our use of the term? Or are we going to be able to get there, as some of these philosophers and scientists claim, from easier cases like M1, S1, and even subcortical regions? That's the dilemma for me, is that something special is going on during overt thinking that is different from intelligent reflexes. And I think that we're going to have to update our notion of representation for that divide. I'm just wondering what you think about that.
So I think that's actually quite a few different questions bundled into one. So I think of one way of understanding your question as asking, can we reduce mental representation to neural representation, to subpersonal representation, right? Can we give an account of overt thought, recurrent, conscious, attentive thought in terms of representations that individual cells or things at a lower level are doing? And it seems like if you're a physicalist, you must in some sense think that we can, right? There is some physical thing going on inside our skulls at the time that you're doing overt thinking that is responsible for you having that thought. And if we could identify what those things are, we could at least point to it and say, it is this very thing. I think that in some sense that counts as a naturalization. But maybe the other way of understanding your question about naturalization is something more like, how do we understand the notion of representation in non-representational terms? And I think maybe that's what I was thinking of when I was talking about naturalization. So we want to give an account of what it is for one thing to represent another thing. And lots of people have given sort of quick stories about this. I was just listening to a talk by Nico Kriegersport this morning where he gives a definition of representation as something that carries information about the external world for the brain, for a purpose, for a function.
But that's exactly. But that is such. I mean, that is such an impoverished view, in so much that it, and I know. I mean, Nico very well, and others will say the same thing. David Wolpert and Artemy have talked about at SFI, Kolchinsky, that a bacterium has a representation of a food gradient outside the world. In other words, and you can naturalize in a bacterium, you can naturalize in sensory motor behavior, you can do it with dead reckoning in an ant. What I'm saying is that my main worry, and it's something that we've discussed a lot, is that simply isn't sufficient to talk about thinking, because there you're actually working, it's called, coordinating with absence. You actually operate on something entirely internal in the absence of the external stimulus, which is why we've discussed on this program before, maps are so interesting, right? The idea that you can plan a route on an internal model instead of the world, and it's a flexible internal model. If you had a real map, you could plan from one exit or another exit, you could turn it around. I mean, I just done work on this. How flexible is this model? But if you really have one, and you can start anywhere in the house and use that model very flexibly, that's beginning to have that content that can be operated on without being anywhere near the house. And the naturalized versions that you're talking about from the bacterium or through, they don't have that quality, right? So it just seems to me that once we start talking about highly flexible, generalizable models of the world, it's a richer concept than the one when you can talk about a bacterium in the Krieger's quarters sense. don't you agree? There's something, they're not equivalent. Do you? I just feel like there's something different.
I agree that there's something different in the bacterial case than in the case where I'm navigating using an internal representation of where things are in the world. But I don't know that I would locate that difference in this idea of information for a function, because how impoverished that notion is, I think, is going to depend on how thin or how cheap your notion of function is. So if you think that function is just, what the thing in fact does, then you have something that's pretty close to just a causal notion. And if you just have a causal notion, then it's going to be harder to see how you can coordinate with absence, right? Or how you can represent something that isn't currently driving your perceptual apparatus. But if you have a richer notion of function, like a more involved notion of function, then I think that more involved notion of function will rule out something like what the bacterium is doing, for example.
So haven't you just pushed the onus for the difference that makes a difference onto the notion of function and taken it away from representation? In other words, at some point, we're going to have to reckon with that difference. Now, you can place it on function or you can place it on representation. But what I'm saying is we're going to have a fleshed out theory of the difference, right? And that's what I think is such a struggle. And what I don't agree is I'd rather we all admitted, like you just did, that there's a difference and we need to flesh it out wherever we place it, rather than push it under the rug, like in that paper that Ed Yong wrote about, where you just find a neural correlate, call it a representation, and you're done, right? Without having to invoke coordinating with absence, a fully fleshed out, flexible model, right? There's the neuroscience of that coordinating with absence is a long way from just finding neural correlates. Wouldn't you agree?
I think I want to be maybe a little more pluralist than you. So I think it might be fine to have a notion of representation that's more like pure responsiveness, right? Of the kind that's, that Ed Yong is talking about in the representational drift article. And you could also have a notion of representation that was richer and more useful for describing things like planning or imagining or considering counterfactuals. But you can have both of these notions of representation. What's important is to not confuse them.
Right. No, absolutely. I'm not going to police the word. God knows it's too late for that. But I just think that there's a qualitative difference between one and the other. And, and I'm just saying that something that you can operate on, whether it's a concept, a space, a word, that, as Grice called these non-natural representations, which, by the way, which just don't work in the telesemantic framework, right? Evolution is not operating on things like this 3 beeps of the bus means it's full, right? There's nothing evolutionary about that, right? Unlike in subpersonal representations. So as Piccinini says, we don't have a telesemantic account of non-natural semantic representations. You can't. So
it's true that we don't have a telesemantic account, but I think that you can have something similar, something in a similar vein. So maybe so I think Hicks talks about this in the book, right? You don't need to have a function that's necessarily stabilized by evolution, but you could have a function that's stabilized by other means, right? So the 3 beeps on a bus is stabilized by the fact that people respond in a particular way to it, and might correct you, or you might not get the response that you want. You didn't know that 3 beeps meant that it was stopping. And so there's like a stabilization of the behavior of the creatures that use those signals to attach particular meanings to particular signals.
Right, although you can be told that as Grice,
selection, but it is selection of a kind.
Well, although Grice, as he points out, you can learn that in one flash before anyone, whether it works or not, you can simply go, oh, I've been told that 3 beeps means stop. It might not be useful, but you've suddenly now got that representation with one instruction. It hasn't been selected for in any way. It might be false, actually, right? But you still have that belief. So in other words, how we're going to form that is through a meaning channel rather than a selection channel. But anyway, I just think that, regardless of terminology, there seems to be a gradation with phase transitions of the different kinds of representation. One where you're coordinating with absence. Sometimes you can coordinate with absence on a map. Sometimes you can coordinate with absence on a concept. I mean, but I don't think we have a neuroscience of coordinating with absence yet. That's my main concern. And I think we do have a neuroscience for things like stretch reflexes, eye movements, S1, M1, and we don't really need to invoke that rich notion of representation to have that neuroscience. But I just don't think we're going to extrapolate from that kind of neuroscience to the coordinating with absence notion that is a bit of a puzzle.
I mean, I think that's kind of an empirical bet, but I think one reason that people are so compelled by the study of representations, even in these cases where we're just looking at responses to stimuli, is that we think that those same activities might be reused in other contexts, might be involved in the kinds of coordination with absence that you're more interested in.
No, yeah, but that's just faith, though. I mean, it might be true, but there's no argument about that extrapolation. I would like to see an actual argument for it, rather than just saying, look, it's,
so we have some evidence that there's activation in perceptual areas when you do visual mental imagery, for example, right?
Yes, but I mean, that's a whole other conversation about what one should, because that's reverse inference, making the idea that that means that they must be doing. But yes, I mean, again, that's human-based work, and I'm a big fan of that kind of human-based work. That, you know, we had beautiful talk just recently about movie watching and the default mode network seeming to have a representation of the plot, right? That's fascinating. That's human work. It's functional imaging. It's a clue. I completely agree. But how that's actually doing what it's doing. But yes, it's fascinating, that kind of work in humans where you get that clue that there's something rich going on in the default mode network, for example. I'm not saying that it's invisible, right? I'm just saying, how do we get traction on that in the same way that one can get traction on how the striatum is working or the cerebellum is working? I just don't have a clear sense of the flavor that neuroscience will take for that. That's all. But it's fascinating. It's really lovely sort of way of introducing it. I'll stop there. Thanks, Rosa.
Joe, do you want to go next? You have been away for a while.
Sure. Thanks, Ida. So, Rosa, that was really fun for me. It's a nice, warm welcome back. I'm sure I've said to Ida and John, I'm not sure I've said it publicly, but like, of all the people that have come on the show, I feel like almost everything you say I agree with more than anybody else. So it's cool to hear you say stuff in like so much more clearly than I could ever say it. So I'm really appreciative to hear the thoughts spun out so nicely. So the question I have is about one of the last things you were saying in terms of representations being with respect to probes. So tying it back to machine learning and AI, this comes up all the time, right? We get really high dimensional data, and then we have to learn a low dimensional representation of that data. The canonical way of doing that is something like PCA, and then if PCA doesn't work, people try like TSNE or UMAP or whatever. And you know, the interesting thing about all those is those are unsupervised learning approaches to learn representation. So there's, in a sense, there's no probe other than the original data. Right, so PCA has this property. If you learn a low dimensional representation with PCA, it gives you the best low rank approximation according to squared error loss. And so in a sense, you could say the probe is that. But for these other machine learning, manifold learning approaches, most of them totally lack any theory. They're just a representation. There's no obvious probe in sight. And so, and this is also kind of related to meta learning. And this is something that Jane Wang talked about like several months ago when she was on the Salon, which is sometimes you have a bunch of tasks and then you learn a representation, and you learn this representation in such a way that you hope it's going to be useful for other tasks in the future that you've never seen before. And so you don't actually know what the probes are, but you've still learned representations. And so I want to hear your thoughts about how explicit these probes need to be, and what if we don't know what the probes are? In what sense are we allowed to talk about the representations?
Yeah. So I guess even in those unsupervised cases, I would still want to say they're all probes. right? Because they are different ways of organizing the data that make different aspects of it more explicit, more salient. So it seems like they are still probes, and you can still say that it's a representation relative to that probe. And the representation will look different depending on what probe you apply to it.
I guess you can say that, and then I wonder what counts as a probe. Like, for example, a self-organizing map, you can prove that it doesn't actually optimize anything. It's an algorithm, it's a procedure. You push data through and something comes out, and now that's your new representation. So what is the probe, and why is that count as a probe?
Okay, maybe I don't exactly understand the question. So so the reason that I was thinking about probes is because I was imagining this kind of debate between two people where they're both looking at the same brain region, say, and one person is saying, look, this brain region, clearly represents, I don't know, rules, or it represents, theory of mind. And the other person says, no, it doesn't represent theory of mind. I can see that the actual correlations are with, where the eyes are pointing in the conspecific that it's looking at. And so that's what it's really representing. And I'm thinking, well, you two disputants here are using different probes, right? Like you have different background assumptions that are causing you to pick out different aspects of the data. And the data is consistent with both of those theories. And so you're not really having a disagreement, right? It's just that there is a representation of eye direction relative to this probe, and there's a representation of like the internal mental states of the other creatures in the room relative to this other probe. And as long as we make explicit what the probes associated with the representational interpretations are, there's no disagreement here. When you talk about these other ways of organizing data using unsupervised probes, maybe there isn't as explicit an explanatory goal. It's something like just like make it more tractable, get rid of unnecessary detail that makes it hard for us to think about the data. But it still seems like that's a kind of probe. And then I sort of wasn't sure what the question was when you said you just shove the data through and you get a representation out. I think I didn't quite understand what you were getting at there.
I just mean that's like, take a bucket of data and then randomly sample some of the rows and some of the columns. Now you have a representation of the data. I think that's true.
Now you have a representation of the data. Yeah, that seems right.
What's the probe, though? I just don't understand what's the probe in that context.
The probe is the thing that you use to create the representation.
The random process that's throughout rows and columns?
Yeah. Maybe here's another way of putting it. A probe can be basically anything, right? Like we can be very liberal about what counts as a probe, but most of the probes that we come up with aren't going to be that useful, right? Or like maybe most of the probes that could in principle exist are not that useful. They don't organize the data in a way that, makes important features for our purposes salient. And so when you have a technique that does make important features for us salient to us, then you should say that that tool is a probe. It's making explicit something that was encoded in the unstructured data that you threw at it.
So you've kind of pushed the burden onto designing of good probes rather than to finding good representations.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think I'm trying to move the debate away from these sort of metaphysical questions that are hard to answer about whether there really are representations there, to more pragmatic questions, maybe engineering questions about what are the most useful probes to design, because it seems like those are questions that people have the resources to answer.
And then there's a question of what are the most useful probes to serve what purpose? Yeah. And that relates back to what John was saying about we want to find probes that are really useful to elucidate representations that are useful for behavior and being able to respond in the absence of stimuli and things like that.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about probes really, really generally. Like you can think of a probe either as like an electrode in a brain, or you can think of it as a way of analyzing your data, so that you're just picking out principal components. You can think of a probe as downstream user, or like the downstream consumer of the neural signals in someone's brain. You can think of it as a decoder, for whatever purpose. Like basically anything that that you use to sort of sift your data can be thought of as a probe.
Cool.
I think a clarification on it might be, right, Rosa, is, you know, your title is, you know, using representations. In other words, to the degree that a representation is only a representation if it's used as one by the first person organism. It's not, in other words, it's not a representation discovered by a scientist as a third person observer seeing a correlation between a stimulus. For example, the example I always give is you can actually decode arm movements from the occipital cortex. But the occipital cortex has nothing to do with arm movements, but you can very beautifully decode it for them. Now, some people would say that you have a representation of arm movements on your occipital cortex. I would say, no, you don't. To call it a representation, it must function as one for the organism. Right? Now, the interesting thing is for the idea of probe as well, from the point of view of a scientist decoding occipital cortex, they could say, for me, it's a representation of arm movements in occipital cortex, even though the organism doesn't use it at all. Or you could say, I'm coming up with a representation in M1 of arm movements, which I think from the point of view of the first person is now a representation. So the probe could be the third person, or it could be the first person. And you could call it a representation in the third person or in the first person. Now, I'm only personally interested in the notion of representations being used as representations by the organism itself. Yeah. And of course, that's why Dennett was always concerned about this, because you end up with an infinite regress. Who's looking at it, right? And we can talk about that. So I think, in a way, Jova, it's just a way of seeing that representation for whom, right? The representation has to be looked at by something, and that's the probe. Right? And I think it's that more general sense that Rosa means, is there's no such thing as a representation in the absence of a receiver. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean.
Right, exactly. I thought that's what you meant. And what we're arguing about here is, when should we be allowed to call a representation that we discover in the third person a correlation between a stimulus and a neural response, and make the assumption that it's actually being used in the first person? And my objection is that that's too quickly elided, right? And you're going to have to do extra work to show that it's going from the third to the first person.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful way of putting it. So I used to be like really upset about the fact that, you know, scientists, you know, use their probes, measure whatever's in the brain and say, I found a representation. It's like, well, we know that it's a representation for you. You can extract that information. How do we know that the brain can? But I think we can say something sort of more general there, which is something like, the more the probe that you are using resembles the rest of the brain that's actually receiving that input, the better you should feel about how good that inference is from the third person to the first person.
Yeah, that's a deep point about how to do your work so that you feel more comfortable doing that jump from the third person to the first person.
I mean, I think something like that is behind people being so feeling so good about linear decoders, for example, right? There's this presumption that that linear decoding is something that downstream parts of the brain are capable of doing, and it's a reason for us to feel bad about decoders that seem totally abiological, because it seems like they're pulling out some kind of information that the brain couldn't pull out and therefore couldn't be exploiting.
I mean, and just for everybody who's listening, who's not fully familiar, because of course you're an expert on this, it's very interesting, right, that when you use in a deep neural net, a conv net that's mimicking the ventral stream, that you only seem to be able to predict the tuning of the layers in a macaque if you actually allow linear decoding, right? So in other words, that's what makes it, you feel more comfortable that's the nature of the way the information is being eaten up downstream, because you wouldn't actually reproduce the coding in the ventral stream if you used a decoder that was not linear, like the way you do there. So I think that's a nice example you're giving of how you can feel that you're on the right track of what's being read along the stream.
Well, I mean, I would guess that if you had an arbitrarily complicated nonlinear decoder, you could perfectly reproduce downstream things given enough data. But the fact that we can do it without that is,
Yes.
I guess, the part that's heartening.
Yes. Right, precisely.
Okay, so I'll ask a few things and we will jump to the questions because there are a lot of good questions today. So, oh, Masvita is here. Hi. So we should bring her up to discuss with us soon. So how would this account, if at all, change how we use representational similarity analysis right now? And how, for instance, my model versus, and to go to a couple of questions that you were asking, including, you know, one needs to explain certain things about it. So I wonder, so if I have a computational model, it makes a prediction about what representations should be similar across which conditions. So the brain's neural patterns in which region should be similar across which conditions and different across which other conditions. And there are particular tools that exist, and we kind of advance those methods as well. And we try to test these theories. And how are we supposed to get like epistemic access to them? By like, you know, measuring them. And then what principles will help us to sort of distinguish between the different methods would be, I have a computational model, it will make certain predictions. There is a series of phenomena, it can explain some of them. And then there is a new one that we posit, and some other theory that could explain these might not be able to explain that. So I'm not sure how any of the discussion that we had today actually changes how we might conduct that, speaking of pragmatic. So that's the first question.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it changes the way that you do your research. I think it instead might change the way that you communicate your research to people who are using representation in a different sense. Right, so so it seems to me that I think I said this initially, representation similarity analysis is a particular way of thinking about representation as a scheme, right? As a kind of way of placing particular vehicles in relation with particular contents. And so as a scheme, you're not really testing the validity of the scheme rather directly, right? Rather, you're employing the scheme to make other predictions about how the system works, about the kinds of responses that you might see to different kinds of stimuli behaviorally. And then how good the scheme is just going to depend on how useful it is for as sort of like a cog in your overall explanatory project.
So I'm not sure who you have in mind, because the four notions of representation that you provided, they don't seem to be, so and the philosopher's notion of representation, I agree, it's different. But let's look at the four notions of representation you provided. One was mental representations, personal level thoughts, experiences that are introspectively accessible. That's, you know, okay, but they would rely on some neural representation as well. So let's focus on the neural ones, which is three of them. You have three sort of parts of this that focus on the neural part. Assuming we're physicalists, we think that the mental representations at least supervene on some neural representation. So let's go to the neural representation notion. One of your three notions is pattern of neural activity. Yes, any notion of it would be some pattern. And then the other one is informational signals subserving a particular function or playing a particular computational role, which could also be patterns of neural activity, but it could be what we call process versus representation. So it could be that some of us actually don't call this representation per se, but it could be something that operates on a representation. For instance, if something adds a gain to a representation, compared to another one, by adding gain to one region versus another, it might use some representations itself, but what it does is a function, it's a process, it's not a representation. It's operating on something else, which is something that some neurotransmitters do, or for instance, gating in basal ganglia might do, or top-down PFC sort of might do. So it seems like patterns of neural activity is one part of the definition. It's not that it's different from the fourth one, which is the scheme for mapping a class of content, which is information or states, to some kind of neural configuration. So that would still require a pattern. It would still supervene on a pattern of neural activity. So it seems to me that, so the way that I look at it, it doesn't seem confusing to begin with, based on what I've seen being practiced in the field, right? Because mental representation, person level, let's say the imagining John's face, right? Imagining John's face or seeing John's face, that's a mental content that's introspectively accessible to me. I am right now seeing John's face. I close my eyes, I can imagine what John looks like, okay? Now it supervenes on some pattern of neural activity in my FFA, for instance, and something probably my prefrontal cortex, specifically medial and posterior medial, to help me conjure from my memory what John's face looks like when I'm imagining it, right? So there's patterns of neural activity involved. There are some informational signals that do play a particular computational role. There's the signals in the FFA that are from the representations, but there's also signals from my PFC or from my memory that tells me this is John. So I recognize him as John Krakauer. I know his name. I have memories. This is my friend. This is my sort of co-organizer of the Salon, etc. And then the scheme for mapping a class of content. So there is a particular way in which, for instance, my visual cortex is organized, my memory is organized, my FFA is organized. It doesn't seem to me that I'm confused about how to use these four different notions. And it doesn't seem to me that there is a way in which one or the other can talk to the other one. It seems to me that there is a way that there is a relationship among these four different sort of, it's not different notions of the representation, it's just they work in different ways with each other. So it confuses me. And second, there is an international conference for, ICLAIR, there is an international conference for learning representation. Yeah. There, I can test my hypothesis that I test on the brain by comparing representational similarity of certain weights of the neural network, their similarity or their cosine distance to each other in one conditions versus another, and see how, for instance, neurally plausible they are, and compare it to behavior, which, for instance, tells me convolutional neural nets are not a good enough model because there's a lot of adversarial examples that they can't cope the same way human brains cope. So something is missing there, for instance. But it tells me that in some other cases, some particular representation in the underlying sort of weights of the neural network its representational similarity might correspond to something our model might expect for a brain, for instance. So I can test those models, like do neuroscience on the weights of those and publish in that same sort of place. So it seems like there are some notions in neuroscience that they're not competing when I look at it and when I know about the practice of it. There are some what you call probes, for instance, representational similarity. It's used across fMRI, it's used in electrophysiology. Other approaches are used, manifold approaches are used. We know that there is different ways to access those representations, but it's fine to call it representations. And then there is correspondence to how we can test the notion of representation in neural networks. So I'm not sure how does any of this change if we, and I'm totally interested in seeing if there is a way in which any of this changes with the philosophical clarification of those terms.
Yeah, so I think I agree with you that that neural activity is involved in all four cases. Like that seems totally clear. But I think that I separated out those different notions because they have sort of different modal commitments. So I think here are two people who I claim disagree with each other. Person one says all neural activity is representational, right? So every time you have the activity of a neuron in the brain, it represents something.
Why would someone look? What's the usefulness of that hypothesis? So where does it go? Like that's what I'm not getting. I understand the hypothetical, but let's bring it to sort of practice. Like why would someone need to say that in neuroscience?
So I think people did say that for a long time in neuroscience because, you have a brain, you're very unsure about what large parts of it do. You stick your electrode in or you do your imaging, you see some pattern of activity. I think the background assumption is that activity represents something, and part of the project is to figure out what it represents. And the way that you would try to figure out what it represents is by trying to find the stimuli that drive it. So I think that's like one motivation for saying something like that. So that's the first person.
Can I just
finish?
So
then,
yeah, go on.
So the person who I think disagrees with them would say, no, it's not the case that all neurons necessarily represent something. There might be some kinds of neural activity in the brain that don't represent anything, that play a different functional role, a non-representational role, right? So that person says it only counts as representation if it's, transporting information from one part of the brain or to the other, or if it's involved in decision-making in a particular way. If it's just for, building up enough activation to drive, motor responses, then it's not representational. Or if it's just doing kind of local maintenance that doesn't correspond to anything in the environment, then it's not representational. So those two people disagree. And I would say that the first person says representation just is neural activity, whereas the second person says representation is sometimes manifest in the activity of neurons, but not always. What makes it representational is that it's carrying information for a function. So I think that's one kind of difference.
Aren't those two things not opposition? Those two things don't seem oppositional, at least the way that it's used. So I'm going to leave a person defines, that's a philosophical way of looking at it. So let's look at how do they use. So I'm going to focus on the use, especially given the pragmatic perspective. I go to a cosine poster, and that poster session will say, this location is represented by this cell. The poster next to it says, this number of cells represent a place field for this location. I don't think these two posters are against each other. Another poster says, here's a manifold of 300 neurons in the hippocampus, and this particular constellation of the manifold it corresponds to this location.
I agree. None of those people disagree with each other, but I think they're making different claims.
They are studying different
phenomena.
Aspects. They're studying different aspects of representation, and we have no problem with all of them being called representation, because as long as they're specifying at which level, because you can have representation at different levels, right? So one is at the level of manifolds, multi-cell, emergent level representations. One is at the level of multi-cell, but just like averaging across a number of cells. Another one might be at the level of individual cell, for instance. And another one right next to them would be doing fMRI and says, hey, look, I did multivariate pattern analysis, or I did representational similarity analysis, or I did correlation analysis, or I did inter-subject correlation analysis, because I had 20 people watch the movie and I trained the classifier on 19 people and tested it on the 20th person, and I could predict which parts of the movie they actually saw, which Janice Chan's talk was about that. All of these would be okay to be called representation, and we somehow don't get confused about it. So how would changing the notion of representation change how we communicate with each other already, or change how we are doing our work? That's what I want to understand on a pragmatic level.
Yeah, so I think there are lots of unproblematic cases, and maybe you just displayed some of them, but I think there are also problematic cases. So if you are convinced that all neural activity is necessarily representational, then you might not consider other functions that neural activity could have. Right, so you might, if you think that all neural activity has to be representational, then maybe you're always going to be looking for something to correlate, internal spontaneous activity with. Whereas it might be that it's performing some kind of homeostatic function.
I see. So what you're saying is that there could be some non-representational activity, neural activity, and if anybody is kind of completely leaving that out of the equation, that's a problem. And I think that's a scientific claim. It's not as much of a philosophical claim as it is a scientific claim, and it's an empirical claim, right? We can see, for instance, but whether they called it representation, the homeostatic one, even if they called that a representation or not, would it change the findings, or would it change how they do their experiments? Like, I want to see what's the threat of using representation, the word representation, wrongly, when there is understanding of each other's methods. The main vehicle of communication of meaning is the methods and the results and the theories. And I think there are disagreements. I totally think there are disagreements that philosophy can help to resolve, right? I do think if someone said representation is only at the single neuron level, that would be like a very kind of, let's call it non-generous notion of representation. So I do think that would have an issue. I agree with you that there are potentially less unproblematic versions of this. But we can still read their papers and understand and compare to others, you know?
So I think you actually gave an example of a place where maybe it would be important to distinguish. So you said there's representation at different levels, right? There's representation at the single cell level, at the population level, and so on. And I think that as long as we're careful to keep those separate and to know which one we're talking about on each occasion, then there isn't a problem. But I think that's not always the case, right? That's the good case, but it's not always the case that we manage to keep those separate. So, so maybe here's another example. We ascribe neural representations using these sort of relatively crude stimulus response paradigms, right? And at the same time, we believe that mental representation supervenes on neural representation. But it might not be the case that the mental representation supervenes on just those neural representations, which we had previously thought through different experimental means had the same content. And so I think it could be misleading, right, to call both of those representations of the same thing, because then you have some kind of implicit commitment to them being identical, even when they may well not be.
What if the identity is not type, but is type token? It's for instance, the idea is that John's face is going to always be represented by some pattern of neural activity in my brain, but it could be that at any given moment, specific neurons of my brains are recruited for that instance of representing John. But if you look at my brain 10 minutes later or an hour later or a week later, there's going to be some other neurons involved. So there's always a population of neurons that you could decode at the moment of measurements, but they could be different sets of neurons at different times of measurement. So that's like a type being sort of, let's say, various dimensions of John's face or different angles and different modalities. One could be on Crowdcast, one could be on, I don't know, Zoom, one could be in person. And another one could be the particular neural populations that get recruited. So at each moment, there would be a measurable set of neurons, but at different times, there could be different ones. And also at every moment, there could be a set of neurons that I can't obviously measure all of them. Nobody thinks we have exhaustively measured neurons in humans in anything. Like, yeah. It's not C. elegans.
Yeah.
So, that would be sufficient. If I have the idea that, would that be sufficient? Like, I'm not sure where that would be problematic.
Yeah, so I think I'm just thinking of something like, what underlies your mental state of representing John is going to be more than just the activation of your face selective cells, right? There's going to be a lot of stuff going on in lots of different areas. And if we stop to think about it a second, I think that's obvious. But if you get used to just saying, the face selective regions represent faces, then I think you might, someone might be misled into thinking that was sufficient for you representing John, that's all there was to you representing his face.
But it is necessary. So if you take out my FFA, I can't recognize John's face as a face anymore, for instance, as we've seen in patients, for instance. Yes, there is a lot of other neurons getting recruited, including dopamine function, like, oh, my friend, I haven't seen him in a long time or something. But at the same time, which is not at all in a face selective region, there could be a prefrontal cortex thing of like remembering, oh, for instance, I promised him to give him this book or something else, right? There are so many things other than that. That's totally understandable. But but at the same time, if you take away my FFA, I won't see his face as a face. I'd see eyes and a nose and a mouth, but I wouldn't be able to see a face. If you zap it, like, at least in some patients, we've seen that. It's not just the FFA. It's like a lot of different regions. Now we know that it's not just one face region. I'm saying this for simplicity. Let's say all of my face regions, you surgically remove them. Some, I don't know, Laplacian demon came and removed all of my face regions. And it's not many. And what happens is that I'm no longer capable of perceiving John's face as a face. I can recognize that, oh, I've seen this person's eyes before, for instance. I know this is a person, but I can't recognize a face, which is something that has been, there's people who have, that sort of impact after particular brain injuries, for instance. So what I'm trying to say is it's true that we are not going to know exhaustively what are all the neurons involved in representing a particular mental state. But it is the case that we can measure some of them, and at least the way that we do it, it's always a comparison. So you always compare it to another situation. You compare when the rodent was here versus when the rodent was here. You compare when I was looking at John's face versus if I'm looking at your face. Or versus if I'm looking at a mug or a house, and then like those are in different parts of the brain, for instance. We compare it to patients when they have that part of their brain open for epileptic brain surgery and it's being stimulated, and all of a sudden the face starts to morph, which is something that Joseph Parvizi at Stanford had shown. He was sort of touching on activating some neurons, and the faces started to, the term the patient used was metamorphosed. So we know that those things exist, right? And together we infer that the mental experience or mental representation of a face depends on particular neurons, obviously non-exhaustively, but there are some that when we manipulate, and that was something that you mentioned, then the mental representation experience changes as well. So I'm a little...
I mean, I think I don't have as much confidence in the lesion kinds of interventions as you do, because I think we can intervene on things that most people think are not representational at all, and also cause these kinds of...
That's okay, but in this case, we are literally activating a couple of neurons, and there's a direct experience of the patient, right? It's totally fine if there are many ways. Nobody claims that this is the only exhaustive way, and people who do, I don't know, they're probably 70 years old. But I haven't seen anyone claim that we have exhaustively sort of have access to all of the possible representation of a given mental phenomena. I haven't seen anyone claim that in any domain.
Can I just, as my face is being discussed a lot.
Sorry about that.
So I just feel like Rosa and Ida, you're speaking at cross purposes. In other words, I mean, Ida's question is the question, right? Which is, let's say, and we've done this, right? Similar, representational similarity analysis. I've actually done stuff with Jorn and Nico, and Ida's obviously right that if there's information that you have framed that is relevant to the representation you care about, let's say it was John's face, or imagining a unicorn for pride, or a finger movement in motor cortex, it's absolutely true, I think, that it would be necessary but not sufficient to show that the differentiating information is there, right? Like I just said, John's face, not John's face, unicorn, non-unicorn. The information using that approach should be there if you want to make some case for that region, right? That must be true, right? It is supervened upon by neurons, right? The real question that I think is being asked, and as Nico says again and again in his talks and in his papers, the information being present doesn't tell you what the computation is. It doesn't give you a theory. And he'll say, yes, let's talk about representation as information, but that doesn't tell us why it's there and what it's doing. And so I think the question that Ida's asking, what we need to answer, and I think one could, is that if you want to have a theory about why that region has the information, and what is the computation being done on that representation to be a thought versus a movement, it just turns out that the notion of representation, which will make it more likely for you to come up with a theory or a computation to go with the information, is more likely to be found. That's the strong point, is that it will help Ida's work in prefrontal cortex and my work in motor cortex if the notion of a finger representation is qualitatively different to the notion of a representation of an idea. And all I'm saying is that the fact that you can do an experiment with representational similarity analysis and find the idea A versus idea B in prefrontal cortex and finger movement A versus finger movement B in the motor cortex, yes, you can do that approach for both. But that doesn't answer why there and what's the computation being done on the idea versus the computation being done on the finger. And what I would argue, and I don't know what you think, Rosa, is it would help have a notion of what the theory of an idea versus a theory of a finger movement would be by being more nuanced in one's idea about representation. If it doesn't help, then get rid of it. It's not actually useful to neuroscientists. But I think it is.
I've been like moving my finger as to mean that I have some follow-up. See, those very different things. And those are represented in different parts of my brain. My motor cortex is not where the meaning of the fingers. But what I want to say, John, is that, so there are situations where representational similarity analysis, I don't know many of them, like maybe for particular papers, they use it with without a clear theory, but usually there's a clear hypothesis to test. Usually we think in condition A and B, the representations would be similar. In C and D, they will be similar, but across A, B, and C, D, they will not be similar. And that's what gets tested, right? And usually it's not a perfect outcome, but it's more or less either sort of passes that or it doesn't pass that. Now, there are challenges, like people have to use a lot of like acrobatics sometimes to get to this. A lot of pre-processing is involved, a lot of like, intermediate steps are involved. And one could arguably say, hey, this was actually so theory-driven that one was looking for an approach to find that representational similarity result that is significant. I can totally understand that methodological critique. I would totally be on board with that methodological critique. And I think that that's the kind of critique that Rosa might totally correctly raise and say, hey, you could run arbitrary number of analysis until some particular, you find something for a particular theory. It doesn't always work in my experience. Like if the brain doesn't want to agree with the theory, it doesn't want to agree with the theory. But I understand that sometimes especially when the p-value is 0.4, like 0.04, like there's something going on that might be important to look under the. But broadly, there's usually a hypothesis, there's usually a theory. And in my case, there is a specific prediction of a computational model, for instance, and not just me, many people, right? So John, I think what you're saying is in line with a critique that I or some other people who are computational might provide to the field, which is have your theories and explain them not just in vague words, but actually in computational prediction making possible formats, right?
And exactly.
Which is a very different direction. It's the opposite of we need to talk about words. It's more like we need to back the words with some models or some quantification.
I would say that a lot of models are fuzzy and verbal, and I do think that there's going to be the work on representational similarity analysis on motor cortex for finger sequences is going to progress further than trying to do it on ideas. And all I'm saying is that having a theory of how ideas are formed versus how fingers are moved, that distinction on the kind of representation that you need for fingers in motor cortex versus ideas will benefit. That difference, which I think is a qualitative difference, will benefit from thinking about representation the way philosophers do. Because you have to understand that difference, that you're not going to extrapolate from sensory motor systems to thinking systems. That's my belief. Of course, I agree with you. Ultimately, you need to make it quantitative. You need to be able to model it. But I think that philosophy can help us realize that you're not going to get from finger movements to thoughts in some easy way. You're going to have to rethink the notion of representation in those two cases. And that will help the theorizing of the kind that you're talking about. That's what I'm trying to say, is it's useful to see the difference rather than the continuum.
Which is a computational approach, not a philosophical approach. But Jova had his hand up, so let's see what Jova had to say.
I just, we're talking about representation similarity a lot and information. I just wanted to, there's some deep mathematical relationships between the terms that people are using here. So representation similarity analysis is essentially testing whether there's any mutual information between one thing and another thing. Now, when John talks about causal analysis and causal inference, it's not mutual information, but it's related. It's conditional mutual information. So if you want to know whether A is causally related to B, you have to condition on all this other stuff. And that's not actually what representation similarity analysis is doing. It doesn't check for that, it just checks whether there's information there. So I feel like what John is saying from a mathematical perspective is that that's not the right kind of analysis to do if we want to understand the representations from the perspective that he cares about. It's not quantifying the kind of thing that he is interested in. Is that fair, John?
Yes, having done studies like this, I find myself a bit frustrated, which is, yes, I feel that I've learned something because I agree that when you look, you're not theory free. I mean, you have a hypothesis, as Ida says, but I still feel, okay, that was quite satisfying that in this region, this particular kind of information that I think is relevant to the behavior is present here and not there. And you have some kind of hypothesis as why it means something for it to be here or there. So it's progress. But I still find myself feeling, well, what actually is it doing? What computation is it uniquely suited to be doing and why? Right? In other words, what does it mean to think of a unicorn in my head? It might be that it's in a particular part of my prefrontal cortex, and you do 100 people, and when they think about a unicorn during Pride Month, they all have a consistent activation in a particular part of the prefrontal cortex. But why there? What's it doing? Why isn't it in the occipital cortex? In other words, I feel like we have to have some other richer theory of the particular requirement that one has to imagine unicorns in one's head, and move beyond just knowing that the information is present there, which is important, and maybe even having a hypothesis why it's there and not in the occipital cortex. But it still doesn't give us a fully fleshed theory of how that representation is constructed in that place. And that's going to require some, as you say, Jovo, a different kind of analysis. And I just would like to think that thinking about these distinctions will help us get that fully fleshed out theory beyond the information being present there.
Although I have to say, so that seems to be exactly the domain of, for instance, representation learning in the prefrontal cortex, reinforcement learning used for representation learning, or other approaches to study how these representations are formed. So I think, and then each of them can be based on a different theory and specifically elicited in a model that learns representations like the brain. Then by comparing the representations learned by the model and what we have measured in the brain, we can see which model actually fits the bill that also shows the same behavior. So that's, for instance, the way that I would approach it. And at this point in my life, I think I don't know anymore which part was influenced by philosophy or other disciplines. So maybe I'm just like I've lost the boundaries between disciplines too much to understand. But it seems to me like Rosa is much more closer to my perspective that I think is computationally informed than what I would imagine would be just philosophy. That's my perception. But I'm going to stop to say hello to, hi, Kevin. Thanks for joining us. You had a highly voted question. Please go ahead.
Can you hear me? Hey, thanks. Hey, Rosa. I think I've just follow you around to different talks, and I think I keep asking the same questions, so I'm sorry about that. I mean, I feel like there's like a long line of philosophers who go into this question of like representation, and they're really interested in behavioral psychophysics, and they're proudly proclaim they don't care about neuroscience. And on the other hand, there's a lot of people who really care about the neuroscience, but are just trying to figure out what representation is from the lens of neuroscience. And I'm wondering why we can't sort of take a broader range and say the probes or tools available to us to figure out when it's useful to attribute representational content aren't just limited to single or multi-electrode or neuroimaging studies. They include behavioral psychophysics, for example, where if I say that a 6-month-old baby amodally completes making a representational hypothesis that has certain behavioral predictions, also has certain neuroscientific predictions as well. It also has certain comparative and developmental predictions. There are other projects you might be interested in, like computational modeling, and these all place constraints on this common question of like, what's the individual representing and what are the neural patterns of activity doing that sort of go beyond what you're finding when you're putting in your electrodes or neuroimaging. I'm wondering, once we have all of these enterprises involved, and they all, in core cases, seem to start agreeing on things about the sorts of things that different parts of ventral processing are doing in the visual system, for example. All these different enterprises seem to start coming to agreement in certain core cases. It looks like, maybe this is just in follow-up on Ida's question at this point, it looks like it's kind of easy. We've got core cases where it works. We aren't just doing it from the perspective of figuring out what the recordings mean. And it looks to be a bit less interest relative because you have all these different projects converging, and it seems pretty non-accidental that they're converging. So I'm wondering, once we sort of broaden our perspective, doesn't that give us a lot more purchase on when it's fruitful to attribute representation?
Yeah, so I think that to the extent that it turns out that the convergence constraints actually result in conversion evidence, we should feel pretty good about that representational attribution. I guess it seems to me like it's an empirical question whether we are going to get convergence in all of these cases, and I think quite often we don't get convergence. And I don't think I'm saying something that you should be hostile to, because I want to say, even when they don't converge, we should still feel okay about calling these representations. We just have to remember to add the index, right? Representation relative to this paradigm, representation relative to this probe. I think as a practical matter, if we have a high degree of convergence from lots of different perspectives, from lots of different kinds of experiments, then we're going to feel really tempted to drop the relative to a probe part of the ascription, because it seems like it's just robustly there from lots of different perspectives. So I think probably this is a terrible way of talking and I shouldn't do it, but it seems like there's something like a continuum of like more real versus less real things. And like the more real things are the things that are like more robustly accessible from lots of different perspectives. And the less real things are the things that are really, only visible from a single perspective, maybe only pick outable by a single really complex probe. Like the gerrymandered things aren't real because we can only see them from one perspective with one purpose. Whereas like the rocks and the chairs and the things are super real because you can like see them in 6,000 ways. And I feel like what you're suggesting happens in, I don't know, certain parts of vision science might be closer to the chairs and the tables than to the super gerrymandered things that you can only see if you build just the right, multi-layer perceptron to pick it out. Is that?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, it feels a bit funny to say, well, I guess the spectrum of reality thing, like, well, there are these core cases where we just say we found the representation because it sort of converges from all these different results. And then there are these other cases we want to add a subscript and we want to just say, well, it's just from our paradigm that we can talk about anything. I mean, maybe another way to think about it is like representation is a natural kind of thing and certain properties cluster around it. And sometimes you'll get all these things coming together, and sometimes you're just going to have hard cases where we might not be in a position right now to be able to arbitrate it.
Yeah,
but I mean, yeah, I'm sympathetic to the thing.
Right. So I think talking about the spectrum of reality is probably terrible practice, and various people at NYU are really, thinking, how did we ever let this person graduate? But maybe a better way of putting it is like, how generalizable are the patterns that we find in this paradigm, right? So in the case where all these different explanatory enterprises converge on certain patterns of neural activity, then we should say those patterns of neural activity are really explanatory, right? By appealing to those, we can explain lots of different kinds of things. They generalize across different explanatory contexts and like different kinds of things that we want to give accounts of. And so those are the things that we should appeal to more. Whereas other kinds of things that we could also pick out using a probe might be more fragile. They might only be useful in a few contexts, and so they're like less good explanatory items. but maybe that shouldn't make them any less representational. It's just that they're sort of special purpose representations.
I mean, maybe the thing I'm thinking is, one question is, what's our evidence for attributing representation? And there are core cases in which we have lots of convergent evidence from different paradigms and theoretical frameworks. In other cases where the evidence is just coming through one paradigm or something. But another question is like, what is representation? I take it when people say the philosopher's questions about representation. It's like, what is it to be a representation? And I wonder, you're trying to sort of answer that question by thinking about when we have evidence for representation, or you're trying to do some sort of
I want to move away from evidence.
Well, it seems like you're saying sometimes we don't know, we won't have evidence for whether we have representation unless we know what it is. And I just wonder if there are cases where it's true that we don't have clear evidence, or the evidence is kind of piecemeal, but that doesn't mean we have to reconstruct different notions of what it is to be a representation just to each of these different projects.
But I think Kevin, I want to move away from evidence, though, and just talk about motivation. Right? So it's not like there's evidence for some fact of the matter about whether there's a representation there. Rather, it's how motivated should we be to attribute representation in this case? How helpful will it be to our explanatory enterprise?
I find this slightly, I mean, I think actually Sam Gershman had a paper that came out recently that, I got to see about, what hypotheses and ideas do you have before you go looking for evidence? And all we're talking about here, this begins to become kind of mystical, is that it makes sense to actually have a think about what representation is and what work we want that concept to do before we start doing our experiments. And all we're saying here is that, like other areas of philosophy, of mathematics, is that it's helpful to clarify your terms and to split things and to think about them before one starts going forward and doing experiments. Obviously, if we have this circularity, which is we need to do science and then we'll find a representation and we'll be corrected by the science, it's just not going to happen that way. It just isn't, right? You're going to have a bidirectionality between the conceptual granularity that you can bring is, as Rosa says, useful to make distinctions with respect to that concept, and then go testing that in scientific experiments. I would say that paper that got covered by Ed Yong, the huge amount of press that it got was precisely because people had an impoverished notion of what representation is, right? It's actually exactly the problem, is that you under-conceptualize a concept, you use it in a very dilute way, it then gets pegged to scientific data. And because it hasn't been thought through super carefully, one overinflates the implications of what's been found. It's a perfect example of why it matters to be thoughtful about one's definitions before one does experiments. Right?
So I just want to...
It matters. It matters.
The last thing I'll say, because I know there are lots of other questions, is I 100% agree with John on this, but I think there are different approaches to thinking carefully about what we mean by representation. One is to try and look at the hard cases where we have very limited pieces of evidence or motivation, or we're looking at single paradigms to figure it out. And the other is to look at the core cases where you have lots of explanatory success and try and think, why do those cluster together? What's going on in those core good cases? And then maybe that will help us in these other cases where it's less clear what's going on, or where people are maybe using it too literally.
Yeah, but one last point about that, Kevin. It's very important, I think. You have to be careful that you don't get circular, because the more dilute your notion, the more vague your notion, the more evidence you're going to find for it, right? Whereas if you're actually quite exacting about what you want to find, for example, there are certain things in the world that we can't see, and they're harder to gather evidence for, like neutrinos, but that doesn't make them any less real, just because they're harder to find. So you have to not, Philip Kitcher talks about this with respect to unity, and generalizability. Don't conflate difficulties in methodologically obtaining evidence with having such a vague general notion that everything will count as evidence, right? So they're not the same thing, right? So if you have a vague notion, you'll have confirmation of it everywhere you look, right? That doesn't give it respectability.
So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kevin. There are a number of people who have asked for their questions to be asked. So while Jovo is inviting the next people, I'll read that so that we respect their wishes that their questions will be read, because some of them are very highly sort of voted as well. So one question is by Montreal, and he says, in your opinion, should scientists aim to reevaluate their methods for interpretation of their data or to seek new methods of study? Further, how would one determine the limits of any specific method of study? And then he says, I wonder if Rosa thinks an abstracted representation can at all be understood using empirical methods.
Yeah, I guess this is a pretty general question. I think all that I'm advocating for is to make explicit this suppressed term when we talk about representations, right? Like representation relative to my experimental paradigm and my probe, or representation relative to my explanatory project. I think that's the only reevaluation or new way of doing things that seems like it would be useful to me. I think, scientists are going to keep on doing what they're doing no matter what. And I think that the value of what they're doing is going to be evident in the results, not in what philosophers say about it. But I do think it would help avoid debates that have no good answer to add this extra place to our notion of representation, so that it's clear when we're talking past each other, when we're just making claims about different things, when we're just making different claims, as opposed to disagreeing with each other about the value of a specific claim.
Goodbye, Kevin. Thanks for your questions. Right, but I guess it depends on how much there is the disagreement. Since I was mentioning a lot of examples where
you were thinking there's lots of agreement as well.
So another question that they asked is by Dan Bear, and he asks, if I type 2 + 2 into my command line, and then operation is performed by my CPU at some point, okay, there's a lot of feedback again. And there is, sorry, I lost his, okay, here. If there is, if I type 2 + 2 into my command line and and that operation is performed by my CPU, is there a fact of matter about what the bits in the register represent? And if there is, how does this differ from the brain?
Yeah, I think that's a super helpful question. And I think there is a fact of the matter about what the bits in the register represent relative to the probe that is our set of conventions in interpreting what CPUs and computers and command lines and screens are doing. Right. So there's absolutely a fact of the matter always about whether a representation is there relative to a particular probe. That's completely objective. That's not perspectival. It's the perspectival part comes in deciding what probe we want to apply, what probe we want to ask that question relative to. And I think you could say that the bits in the register represent not 2 + 2, but something totally different. If you had a different probe, if you had a different convention, that would just be a totally useless convention given the way that we've built our computers.
John, did you have something to say? Right, Dan Bear is not currently invitable. They probably left. That's what they asked to be asked for them. John, did you want to add something? You had something to
No, I think we should I feel that Mihai should get to ask their question. Thanks, Ida. I feel like we've been hogging. Well, I've been hogging.
Hi, Mihai. Go ahead.
Hello. Well, I think Ida and John actually asked this in other ways before, but how do we distinguish between representations and operations on representations? So actually the previous example with the CPU, so, let's say the things that are being represented are stored in registers, and then you have operations that operate on those, that change the data in certain ways, and then the output is a new representation that is then being stored. Can we think this way of the brain as well? Should we think in a different way about it? If it's all neural activity, how do we distinguish between representations and the operations on representations?
Yeah, so I think probably the answer is in what you already said, right? It seems like they have different functional roles, right? Representation is supposed to make information available downstream, let's say, as a first pass. And operations on representations are the things that make it possible for the outcomes of those operations to play that functional role. I do think it's hard to think about that question in practice because, I think in the cartoon way that we think about representations, they're kind of these static things. Like there's some processing and like the output of that processing is a representation. But of course, everything's changing all the time. So maybe it's a little bit hard to think about what the difference is between a representation that's sort of evolving over time dynamically and a representation that's being operated on by other stuff. And I don't really know what a clean way of thinking about that is, but maybe other people do.
Well, I can give, I can give an example. I think, how easy it will be to disambiguate the level of neural signals is another question, but the distinction is real. So let's take a patient with early Alzheimer's. Okay, they begin to have more difficulty with multiplication of the same numbers than they do with adding the same numbers. So there, the representation is invariant. It's the number, right? Say to them, do 4 plus 4 versus 4 times 4. So the representation presumably there is the number 4. But they have more trouble operating on that number through multiplication than they do addition. The operation is multiplication versus addition. The representation is the number 4. They're distinct. Now, how one actually goes about finding the neural correlate, presumably, you could do representation similarity analysis. And so, the number 4 is perfectly intact and easily decodable from the parietal number region in the Alzheimer's patient and in the healthy patient. They're just as easily, there's 4. And then you'd find some other way of using the imaging to go, they're having trouble multiplying it, but they're fine adding it. Now, I don't claim to know, I defer to Ida. How would you do that kind of experiment, right? But it's very clear that those are different, right? And one should be able to do experiments that actually show that. And that's the point that Nico, in his whole position, he says, I don't want to say that once I found the information, the number 4, that I understand why the number 4 should be there and not somewhere else, nor do I know how you operate on that number 4 just by knowing that the number 4 is there. Okay, so again, it gets to this notion of, do we represent the number 4? Yes, we all think about the number 4. Humans are good at that, maybe some animals, and then we operate on it. That's exactly where the notion of representation becomes useful, right? Whereas if you move your fingers, I don't think representation for your finger should be thought about in the same way as the number 4 that you operate on. So this is where it starts to get interesting. You start coming up with theories about those different types of representation. You start to worry about it. You start thinking about a different theory of how you operate on the number 4 to add or multiply it versus just moving your finger and exerting 2 newtons of force. It begins to become useful to think about these differences, right? And I just think that this is where this conversation is going. But it is a real difference, Mihai. They are different, and you can see it behaviorally, and you could presumably design some nice experiments to disambiguate the representation from the operation.
Another thing that I'd add to that, Mihai, is so the first 2 experiments that I published during my PhD are about doing some task right now and then remembering to do another task later on. On some trials, the task you were doing right now, for instance, was judging the color of a number, but the next task was either judging its parity, whether it's odd or even, or the next task was to judge whether it's bigger or smaller than 5. So these are two different tasks, right? And what I did was decode from the brain which regions could had information about what's the next task going to be while you're doing something else. So that's called prospective memory, remembering something else. So what I was looking at was not a representation of a task they were doing. It was also not a representation of a thing or a stimulus. It was how the brain was storing some patterns as a placeholder for a task I was going to do later. So it was memory for a task I was going to do later on, right? And then in another paper, for instance, my advisor had looked at just the magnitude, like when you're doing the task versus when you have to remember to do it after a delay period. So he had done that before me. What I did was during that delay period, you were also doing something else. So the same brain regions that I would use to do the task couldn't just say activated and be on guard until the moment arrives. If there was a delay, it was like 10 seconds delay, that's what I would do. Like the brain would prepare, and when the stimuli will come up, it can just switch. But if you're doing something else, a lot of the computational resources would be already occupied by another task, by that ongoing task, which is, for instance, color judgment, right? So the brain would need to store some representation of this future thing that's more compressed and in some region that doesn't interfere with what you're doing right now, because the stimuli was the same. It was numbers that were either red or green, right? So this example is a case in which not only was there a difference between the representation of the number and the representation of a task, and I actually made a neural network model of this and a reinforcement learning model of this that we just actually published the reinforcement learning model of it. Not only that, there was a difference between the representation of a number and a task. There was a difference in the representation of the number depending on whether you were looking at the color feature, whether you were looking at the parity feature, or whether you were looking at the magnitude feature. So the same number can be represented in different ways depending on the task. And not only that, the specific task that you wanted to do, depending on whether it's the current task or whether it's the future task, would have a different representations. So there is but at the same time, when that task becomes activated, when I switch to that second task, when I switch to the prospective memory task, then it will sort of occupy a lot more spaces in my brain because it now needs to control what I'm doing right now. It's no longer something for the future. It's what I'm doing right now, right? So then that representation of a task turns into processes that I do on the representation of the number on the screen, specifically on the representations of the feature of the number that's related to the current task, which is called task domain. So there is task operations, which is what I'm going to do with it. I'm going to judge parity or magnitude. And there is a task domain, which is which features of the stimulus do I care about. So when I'm judging parity or magnitude, I don't care about the color. It doesn't matter if the font is yellow or green or red. I just care about whether the number is odd or even. Is it divisible by 2? Is it divisible by 2 is the operation. And the numerosity of that number is the domain, the stimulus domain I'm looking at. But if I'm, for instance, judging whether a number is red or green, I don't care if it's odd or even or if it's big or small. I just care whether it's red or green. So I'm not caring about the numerosity of it. I'm just caring about the font color, right? So I'm looking at the same stimulus, but depending on what I want to do with it, I'm processing different, I'm representing different features of it. And depending on what I want to do with it, I'm using different features of it. Now, another colleague of mine during my PhD showed that even if you're doing something and some things are shown in the background, your brain is also processing them. So in her case, you were doing some task, which was like you were judging if a U was in this way or it was a C, like this way or that way. We're just pressing left or right. In the background, there were photos of cars. And it turns out your brain's ventromedial prefrontal cortex was actually encoding the value, how much you valued each car, how much you liked each car, in spite of the fact that it had nothing to do with the task you were doing. So there's some other kinds of representations that are task irrelevant that still happen, and they might actually interfere with your current task, which is why distractions are, for instance, challenging, right? So,
I mean, the meta point about that, what I just described, Mihai, is that I just don't see how you're going to be able to get traction on those fascinating prospective memory phenomena without a very rich notion of representation. Okay, in other words, the kind of representations that are talked about in those kind of prefrontal, Brodmann area 10 kind of experiments are just a different beast to what we talk about when we're in S1, for example, or V1. And it's precisely an experiment like the one that Ida described, where a rich, useful notion of representation becomes important. I think that it helps even to use that language in those kind of experiments. So that you're not going to extrapolate from sensory motor experiments to those kind of experiments. You just have to do those kind of experiments from the get-go with those concepts, right? I mean, that's what I think. I feel that what we just heard there is sort of proof of a need for a different way of thinking about computations over representations when it comes to those kind of experiments versus when we're talking about primary modality cortex, for example. So it's, I mean, Rosa, wouldn't you say that's where representation really begins to rear its head and it's useful, is in kind of experiments that are human cognitive neuroscience experiments?
Well, memory is the kind of thing that I was wondering about. So, for instance, when in the literature, when they talk about grid cells and place cells and hierarchies in grid cells, do both grid cells at different levels represent the same data that is later on going into place cells? Are they just tools, as it were, for reducing dimensionality? Is there a representation, or is this just part of the process? Is this just a function to reduce whatever data came into something that is then to be represented as a place, for instance? Are all of these representations?
You see, this is what's so lovely, is that you're basically, I think, manifesting the symptoms of the problem we're talking about here, which is that one begins to realize that the word representation, without some qualifier on it, some richness on a spectrum, it begins to just blur. It's, oh, should I call this a representation? Should I call that a representation? The word begins to not do any work unless one starts to, as Rosa said at the very beginning, add qualifiers, not just quantitative ones, but qualitative ones, right? Otherwise, what am I using? And I think that that's why it's useful to have these philosophical discussions, because you need, as someone is saying, thin and thick notions that do different work, and you need a thick notion for Brodmann area 10. You can have a very thin correlational version for S1. And as long as we recognize that, then we'd be okay. But unfortunately, we don't. Unfortunately, we collapse the terms.
I don't know if we need different notions, to be honest, because like the methods that I used are very similar to the methods that were used for MVPA in the visual cortex that I use, for instance. And also I use sort of, so I don't think it's...
Conceptually, they're different, I think.
The model of what is happening is different, but the model, but the method for diagnosing the representations is not very different as long as you design the experiment right. The difference here is that you need to design a much more complex experiment to elicit the representations in the PFC and dissociate them or decode them accurately. Like you need to have like a better idea.
Yeah, can I just ask for clarification on some of the things you said, Ida? So you said the representation is different when they're doing different tasks.
That's right.
So when you say that, you mean the pattern of neural activity evoked in response to the stimulus is different when they're doing different tasks?
I mean two things. So if it's the current task, yes, the pattern of neural activity in not just the sensory and motor cortex, in other parts. Yeah. But second, when they are currently doing something else, but just after this, in 25 seconds, they're going to do another task. And we've told them to remember what's the next task going to be. It's not just working memory anymore, because their working memory is super busy and the periods are about 30 seconds. So it's very long periods. So they're not consistently maintaining that. And in fact, in one of my papers, I just dissociate between the encoding and retrieval. In another model, we model it as an interaction between working memory and episodic memory. So the second point is when you're not currently doing the task, So it has nothing to do with what you're doing with the stimulus and motor, but you're going to do it later. So in both of those cases, two different notions of same notion of representation, two different notions of what we mean, the current task representation or the prospective task representation.
Yeah, so I was thinking you really are using two notions of representation there, not across the different tasks. You're using one notion of representation where you just mean the activity that is associated with keeping track of the number for the task. And that's different for different tasks, which makes sense. But the other notion of representation is, in each case, you're actually representing the same thing, right? You're representing the number, you're representing the stimulus.
In none of them did I look at the stimulus representation. So the stimulus was always—
I don't mean the perceptual representation. I just mean there's some sense in which in each of those cases, you have to keep track of the stimulus in order to do the task. And so what you have to represent—
Not when it's future. So the stimuli are appearing every 2 seconds on the screen. And currently you need to do the color judgment. And in 30 seconds, you're going to need to do the magnitude judgment.
Yeah.
You don't need to remember the current stimulus has nothing to do with what's going to happen 30 seconds later. You don't need to remember any of this. So that representation of the prospective task, the task I'm going to do later, has nothing to do with the current stimulus. But we kept the stimulus the same so that we can dissociate the representation of the future task from the representation of a particular stimulus. But then the task set, as it's defined in terms of task domain, which is which dimension of the stimulus, which feature of the stimulus am I going to pay attention to, and the task operation, which is what am I going to do with it. And in the case of parity and magnitude, in both cases, you're paying attention to the numerosity of the stimulus. So that also was kept the same. And the only difference was, what am I going to do with the numerosity? In one case, parity, and in one case, magnitude.
Yeah, so doesn't it seem like there are two notions of representation that you're using there? One is the internal thing, whatever it is, that is keeping track of the numerosity, right? That's a representation that is unchanging. Its content remains the same. It's always keeping track of the numerosity. That's one notion. And the other notion is this thing that's changing. And that's something about the vehicle, something about the pattern of evoked neural activity that's different.
I don't understand what you're saying, to be honest with you. So nobody's keeping track of the stimuli. Like, that's not what we're studying. Keeping track of numerosity is not what we're studying. Why? Because all the tasks rely on that. What we are studying, or what we are decoding the difference of, is what are you going to do with it later on? Are you going to do a parity or a magnitude? So
yeah, so a difference in what you do with it corresponds to a difference in the pattern in neural activity, which makes perfect sense.
But not, you're not doing it now. You're going to do later. Yeah. So this is an abstract representation of the future task set, so to speak. So the difference here is a difference between current task and the prospective task representation. Two different types of representation, but the same meaning, the
same content.
Actually, no. The content of the current task is a different one. It's, for instance, color, right? So it's like, at least when we are at this moment, there's different tasks that are happening in the brain. In one case, there is the ongoing task, which is the color task, and a future task that I'm not doing it right now, which is the magnitude task. Then later on, there's just one thing I'm doing. It's just a magnitude task. So it's not really the same content either, because it's also in different regions. Because when my brain is busy doing the color task, some other part of my brain needs to keep track of what I'm going to do next. But when my brain is only doing one task, when I switch, then it's another kind of story. So the point is, the same representation notion and the same methods for comparing representations across different conditions can help me study the current task, the future task, various notions of task. So that's what I'm trying to say. It's not the same content, because they're doing something else entirely.
So the only notion that you're using is the notion of neural activity pattern necessary for, or at least implicated in successfully performing the task.
No, it's the neural patterns that can decode what you're going to do next.
That predict what you're going
Jonathan, just so, because it's getting 6:20 and I have to go. Jonathan, you've been so patient. Do you want to ask your question before the representation of you on the screen disappears.
Just to be clear, John, this was the back and forth between me and Rosa was not even half of your back and forth with her.
I wasn't. I was actually. I agree with you. That's not what I was implying at all.
But go on, Jonathan. We would love to hear from you.
Yeah.
So my general question is, the majority of the examples that we've used when talking about representations have to do with what I might philosophically call sensory data that is transmitted by our senses. I'm actually interested in what we might call affective or conceptual data. That is, Rosa, how does your account, say, engage with questions of representation with regards to things like love or happiness or affective states as indicated by neural activity in the brain? Because it's relatively easy I'm using easy as a catchism. None of this is easy, right? But it's relatively, we've done a lot of work thinking about what different neural structures do with regards to vision and other kinds of perceptual tasks. But I think there's still some fuzziness when it comes to kinds of affective tasks. And this is a little bit similar to John's question about the neural activity when we think of concepts like for, right? So my question here is, I like your approach, but I think does this do more work when we're thinking about affective neural representations versus sensory neural representations?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to give a pretty boring answer, which is, you have a different project, right? You're trying to explain different things when you posit affective neural representations. So that's your probe, and you will pick out representations relative to that probe. So I'm not advocating for any particular probe, right? I'm not advocating for the particular kinds of probes that sensory neurophysiologists, for example, use. I'm not saying that's the only way to get representations, although that seems to be a useful way of identifying representations for that project. I think for your project, just as for the Denetian project of identifying people's personal level thoughts and desires and beliefs, you're going to have different probes, and those different probes will pick out different physical exponentia, right? Different physical things that we can use as resources to explain the phenomena that you're ultimately interested in explaining.
So this gets me to a second kind of manifold part of it, which aligns with some of the things that John was saying earlier, that we may need a richer notion of representation to say account for these things in a broader unified structure. But I wanted to pick out one thing, right? It's the physical structures as explanata for the affective experience that I kind of want to pick out at, because I think that leans more towards the as you described, the industrial grade physicalism. Yeah, right. And that I think is in tension with a more robust notion of representation that I think we would need to, say, provide an efficient description of all of the kinds of neural activities vis-a-vis, or an efficient description of neural activity vis-a-vis representation across the variety of human experience.
Sorry, I'm not sure I quite understood that last point. What does the industrial grade realism have to do with the kinds of phenomena?
Well, so if we take it to be the case that neural phenomena represent affective experiences, right? And if we take it to be this case, and our models of representation, or at least the ways that we're deploying representation, are taken to be identical or similar between sensory neural representations and affective experiential neural representations, I think we're going to have to do something to the notion of representation, either make it more robust or build a kind of walled garden between the two to say we're talking about different things, right? But if we make a more robust notion of representation, I think it does push back against the industrial grade realism insofar as it says we need to think differently, broadly, more thoroughly about these things if we want to posit explanations rather than descriptions, right?
Yeah, so maybe it would help me to get a better grip on what kinds of explanations you have in mind. So, so you're interested in our affective experience. You're interested in how it feels to be in love, or in aesthetic experiences, or maybe things that sensory neurophysiologists don't really study very much. Okay, so what notion of representation do we need for that? I think that's a question for you, right? Like what, why should we, like what's the actual thing we're trying to explain? Are we trying to explain people's behavior? Are we trying to explain people's reports of their experiences? Are we just looking for the neural basis of these different kinds of states? Like it seems like it depends on what kinds of questions you're interested in. But given those questions, you ought to be able to construct the relevant probes to pick out the neural bases of those things. And I don't think that requires a different notion of representation. It's just representation relative to a different probe. Does that sound like a representation?
Yeah, you keep saying that, Rosa. I mean, I think that what you keep doing is pushing the distinction onto either the word function or probe.
Yeah,
but I think that
definitely.
You just keep pushing the difference somewhere else. And I just think that the point that Jonathan's making, which is that there's something about talking about the neural basis of the affective states that he's talking about, that it's going to be further away from the question that he's asking when you look at the neural information, in a way that when the neural information is present for reflexes and even finger movements, it feels closer to the explanation. There's going to be less, you're going to feel less alone when you go, this is what motor cortex is doing to move a finger. It's close to the neurons. When you get to what Jonathan's asking, I think Jonathan, I'm not trying to speak for you, but I agree with you. The way I'm interpreting you is that it just feels further away, right?
I think you're right, that it is further away, that maybe there won't be a clear-cut, satisfying explanation of why we feel the way we do in neural terms, as there is a simple, clear-cut explanation of why our fingers move the way they did in neural terms.
Right, but if you agree with that, and I'm so glad okay, but the fact that you agree with that, then it cashes out, it seems to me, that difference in terms of the notion of representation we're going to have to use for those two things, right? There has to be some reason for that dissatisfaction over that increased distance, right? And we have to have, now I don't know what the language is, maybe representation isn't the language for it, Rosa, but we have to have some language for that distance, even though the methods can be shared. That's the delicious paradox, is we can do the same kind of analysis, we can do the same kind of method, but the gap is greater in one case than the other, and we have to have a language for that gap.
I mean, I feel like you guys are asking, sorry, please go ahead.
Oh, no, it's so I think, so there are a couple things. I generally agree with much of John's characterization of my position, but one of the things is, when I'm thinking about this, I'm wondering if there's a tension between describing, say, or using neural activity as a description versus neural activity as an explanation, right? Because an explanation provides a causal account of a given set of phenomena, whereas a description largely deals with how the phenomena are experienced or how the phenomena appears, so on and so forth. And so I think that one of the things that I'm trying to get at here, kind of parallel to what John is saying, is that when we're using representation with regards to affective representations, I think one of the things we need to think about is whether or not we're using them as explanations or descriptions, right? And I think there's a tendency to treat them as explanations when we really, at least in my view, don't have probes sophisticated enough to provide us with explanatory data, right? Which would then align with some of what you're saying, Rosa. So my philosophical perspective is kind of mixed between the two, right? One, we need more robust definition of representation if we're going to treat the neural data that we've got as explanations, and that more robust data can only come from better probes, right? But if we're going to treat it as description, then that's a different project or a different kind of thing we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that gets onto these kind of deep and unsettled questions about the nature of explanation and description, right? Because some people think that explanations just are descriptions that of the right kind, right? Like if you describe the mechanism that generates your phenomenon sufficiently in sufficient detail, then you have given an explanation of your phenomenon. Like that's one way of thinking about it. You might think describing the causal, processes that gave rise to the phenomenon you're interested in. That's another kind of explanation. So I'm not sure like what the principal distinction between explanation and description is supposed to be. I guess there's this sort of pejorative sense of description where you're like merely redescribing your phenomena rather than explaining it. And maybe that's what you have in mind. But I don't think that a neural description of affective states would just be a redescription, because I think the primary way in which we characterize affective states is sort of at the personal level, at the level of folk psychology. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. I'm thinking more the purposes to which an explanation versus a description are put, right? And so the practical, if we're going to be
so the description picks it out, but the explanation is supposed to give us more insight into how it's generated or how it works.
Ways to control it, to predict it, so on and so forth, right? So you can describe a phenomena using neurological terms with the activation of some systems, but you can also explain the phenomena by saying, in the activation, without activation X, Y phenomena does not happen. And insofar as we know that activation X produces Y phenomena, we can change the way the phenomena appears, predict the way the phenomena appears. And so I think gets to some of what Ida was asking a little bit earlier in the chat. The usefulness there would be in the purposes to which the science is put. Right, describing one state, picking out the features of a state versus controlling the outcome of that state. But yeah, so for the sake of time, other folks have questions.
Jonathan, I find it really lovely that the position you just took. How much it relates to representation, it's an open question. Although I agree with you, it probably does. But I completely agree with you that as you go from the sensory motor to the cognitive, the neural story goes from being an explanation. It's perfectly okay to have a neural explanation for reflexes and eye movements, to being kind of just a description, confirmation of an explanation will have to be couched in non-neural terms, right? And that's, I think, what is a big challenge for us, is that the explanations for cognitive phenomena will end up not being neural. They'll be confirmed by neural data, whereas sensory motor phenomena are perfectly well explained with neural data. And that's frustrating for people who want a neural explanation for cognitive phenomena, and hence they go into the fly, because they basically turn a sensory motor behavior in the fly into an honorary cognitive phenomena, because it allows them to stay neural. But the question is
Shade.
yeah, the question is does that relate to some sort of qualitative distinction in the way that one uses the term representation for those phenomena? And I think so, but it's not obvious. But I'm having a very pleasant, warm feeling at how completely I agree with you this evening.
I'm with you that there is a difference, and we can't honorary address everything in the fly, but that's also cool research. Javier, please keep it. So great to see you here. Keep it short, because Jovo has to run to his child, and I think John has to run to his parent. So
yeah, no problem.
Here.
Hi, everybody.
John just is a child.
Yeah, the discussion has evolved a little bit now into affective, but I wanted to circle back to sort of the topics when Mihai was on screen. I found his question very clarifying of separating the idea of representation with operations of representations. And then there's something that you said, Rosa, that got me thinking, which is, you said a representation, its function should be to allow the information to be accessed downstream. But if that's the case, then what isn't a representation? Every step of the way in that case, with that definition, is a representation. I'm not sure I have a problem with that. And then connecting to John's distinction between sort of like thought processes versus sensory representations. Again, with that definition, I'm not sure there's a difference. It just depends like when you hop off sort of the train, you know? If you're doing like finger movements, then you require fewer hops on the representation train versus when you were actually trying to represent, you know, thoughts or numbers or whatever. I don't know. I just wanted to put that out there for discussion. Exactly. Turtles all the way up and all the way down.
I mean, to clarify, I am totally not endorsing that definition of representation. I just think that that's something that people often say. And I think you're right to be a little wary of it because it seems like it makes representation very cheap and kind of ubiquitous. Maybe people are okay with that. But it's true that, you know, on that definition, like, you know, your photoreceptors are representational, right? Maybe even the lens of your eye is representational because it is directing the photons where they need to go. It's making information about the outside world available to stuff downstream. But I think almost nobody would want to say that the lens of your eye is representational. It seems like it's not the right kind of thing. So I think, you know, different people say different things. They try to add more conditions to ways of picking out representation that goes beyond just making information available. So maybe you would add something like it's something, it makes information available in a way that cannot be captured by a purely physical description that doesn't appeal to representations, right? So you might think you can give a perfectly good physical description of what the lens is doing that doesn't appeal to the content of what is being perceived, and you wouldn't lose anything thereby. And that's why we don't say that's representational. And you might say the same thing about the photoreceptors. Maybe you could also say the same thing about cells in V1, right? It's not, depending on what additional conditions you put on it, you might end up ruling out and ruling in different kinds of activities of different kinds of cells in the brain and in the body. So I think it really depends. But I'm absolutely not committed to the strong definition that you just quoted.
And Javier, you asked the right question, because I would say that, to me, talking about finger representation in motor cortex sounds as silly to my view of representation as saying that a lens represents. Okay, I actually feel like it does no useful work to talk about a finger representation in motor cortex. Okay, I think
John,
it does make sense to talk representation in the terms of the kind of experiments that I were talking about. Then I would use the word representation.
So just a quick show of hands. Who thinks retinal representations are representation? Because that's a term, and I just put a link there from, okay, yeah. Retinal representations, Rosa, are they representation?
Relative to some explanatory project that needs them, sure.
John, do you think that what's in the retina, what can be decoded from the retina, is not a representation?
Not a representation.
Okay, Jovo?
I think I'm with Rosa in that it depends on who's reading it and why. But I agree with that even at the trivial level of the lens. If you do an RSA analysis, the lens has information about the outside world. It's
well, then use the word information. Then use the word information, not representation.
Wait.
Dude, I don't care which word we use.
Would you call decoding something in a mirror representation?
Yeah, if you think pictures are representations,
I don't have a problem
then it seems like
with it.
mirrors.
But that's a different
also
notion. But that's a different notion. That goes into the humanities notion. I think that for me, there is a very clear distinction between neural representation and external ones. So a picture is an external representation. So I'm not confused about that. A mirror is an external representation. A camera lens is an external representation. It's not even, in a human.
Although Wittgenstein in the Tractatus, you know, when he comes up with the
wait a second, I know it's still talking.
John had something very important to say. How dare we?
Right.
No.
Sorry to interrupt John's thought.
Sorry, John, that my continuing what I was already saying might be interrupting your thought. John, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm leaving. I'm going to have my fried green tomato. I'm leaving.
Oh my God! Now you're throwing a fit.
No,
No, please go ahead. Say the Wittgenstein thing.
I think the picture is very interesting, because I think that the kind of representation that is useful to invoke for cognition is very much the idea that Wittgenstein came up with in the Tractatus with his picture theory of language. You have a picture that is it is a substitute. It is, again, coordinating with absence. And it's a very interesting idea that you conjure up a picture to understand something. And that's the kind of representation. Presumably that picture theory of language is happening somewhere prefrontally, would be my guess. But to say that the picture theory of language representing a map, representing an idea, is the same beast as saying that there's representation in the retina is so absurd to me that it actually ends up what Javier, I think, is sort of intuiting, that it just does no interesting work once you allow that. It just becomes useless. That's my view.
Yeah, I really want to resist the question that Ida asked. Right? I don't think it's useful to ask this question, is there retinal representation? Is there really a representation in the retina? Right? Because it seems like you can say that there is. It's always available for you to say that there is. The question is whether that does us any good in trying to explain anything that we care about. Right? It seems like we want to know not just, is there a representation there, but like, what does it represent? And how does positing that representation help us understand how the visual system works, or how the eye works, or, whatever the actual phenomenon you're interested in works? Like, just asking the bare question, I think, forces us to make commitments out of context that aren't going to be super helpful.
We were in a very clear context, though. We were talking about neural representations or brain representations and how the word representation is being used in neuroscience. And the term retinal representations is used because that's what gets translated and goes back into the brain. Even Wittgenstein's, for instance, inverted spectrum is possible, like with some kind of imaginations of the sort of the neural representations. And in fact, when he was saying it's impossible to know, it's actually possible if you look at the rods and the cones and potentially the representations in the brain. So I don't know. I think it's okay to have a liberal notion of it as long as we clarify the levels. I think that my difference with you might be that for me, it's just, there's different levels of representation. And depends on the level of measurement, the theoretical or computational complexity of the emergence of them. And I'm okay with the idea that so I think that with some things, I like Mihai and the follow-up by Javier's question, which is this idea that there would be some things that are more geared towards processing, maybe sensing. So the idea of the bacteria going towards a gradient of food, that's a little bit more perception. Does it need representation? I mean, if it's just like 0 and 1 in terms of is this food or not? Not so much. In fact, there's two things. They follow two different things. One of it gives them food, one of them gives them social populations. But even then, is that a representation or is it just a sensor? And so for me, I think that although we can talk about retinal representations, it's a little bit closer to the notion of a sensor, while the visual cortex representations is a higher level. It's a neural representation. It's doing something that's it's post-processing after the sensor has given the input in. So I would make a distinction in terms of what's the level of representation. And I feel like, Rosa, I'm learning that we are much closer, our positions to each other, than I had initially thought. Like the first time that we met, I thought it was very different. But now, after seeing the sort of talk and talking to you, I realized that actually we're very close, because you also think that the methods is the location where we need to focus, what you call probes, what we would call methods, and also the theories or sort of computational models that actually justifies why use this method to compare this and that. So I think that's what you mean by context or task, and what you mean by probe. It's translatable to, I guess, for me, theoretical or computational framework versus the methods. So I feel like it's a lot closer, our positions, than I had thought. So I can't disagree with anything. But I
think what you call levels is quite similar to what I'm calling different kinds of explanatory projects. So maybe it's more of a verbal disagreement, where I don't think that neuroscience is like a univocal explanatory project, right? Like neuroscientists want to explain different things. And relative to those different things that they want to explain, you might want to call different things representations. And I think you're saying that those are just representations at different levels.
So I think that the difference there, and I'm very grateful you mentioned that. I think the difference is that I think there is a method to the different projects, and there is a structure to the different projects, and they are related to one another. Just like unified. I think that's the difference between us. I think there's a systematic relationship between the different projects, and that systematic relationship is measurable, theorizable, computationally modelable. And it's not just, oh, it's just different projects. It's actually, there is some continuity, even when we disagree in words with each other. The methods and the findings, the experimental approaches, the questions, there is a continuation where there's higher level representations and lower level ones, which in my opinion, actually corresponds to different levels of representation or abstraction in models too, which is something a lot of us might be doing. So for instance, judging the magnitude of a number needs more layers of processing than judging if something is red or green, for instance. Needs more layers and potentially more like, more than just like having a feed-forward classifier in order to get there. If you want to do multitasking in a system, if a system needs to do color, magnitude, parity, addition, subtraction, and division, you just need more layers because there's more different things that are happening and you need different architectures, for instance. So that's the units that I think in. What architecture is required for this representation to be learned and used? And is it sort of transferable to another place? So I think if we think in terms of theory, questions, architectures, and what counts as representation in that architecture, then it's just a matter of levels. Some things are more simple, some things are more complex. So it's a little bit like almost like different species of neural architectures for me. I see Javier is nodding, so if you want to add something, please go ahead. It's your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think with all of this, it seems like we're arguing about when to start calling something representation. I feel like that's almost an impossible thing to answer. Like, maybe this is a question that maybe John, you can answer your next theoretical piece.
I don't think it is impossible.
At level 75, at level 75, it stops being a transformation or whatever, like intermediate state. But I mean, maybe here, if we start going a little bit more pragmatic, if we go into like parallel distributed processing land and all of that, like if we start thinking about, there's sort of like theoretical representations, like you can represent the parity of number, its magnitude or whatever. Then the question is like, can I do that already? And how many of those do I have? For instance, like with the Stroop model, you get tied up because you are trying to go through the same representation, like you're reading representation unless you, I don't know, spend 10 years trying to develop a second representation that separates like automatic reading from color processing. You won't be able to do it because you're going through the same representation there, right? So I don't know when you start calling something a representation and
yeah, but you could argue, but you could say that about anything. When do you start calling someone an athlete? When do you start saying something's love? When do you start saying something's art? I mean, you could say that about everything. We should just get rid of all those terms or use them for everyone. We can just call everyone an athlete. Everyone's in love. In other words, the thing is,
the problem is just that it's a vague concept.
So yeah, I'm saying that you can take a vague concept and do interesting work with it and make distinctions. Otherwise, we should just give up on all the words we use, and there's a whole field of philosophy called vagueness, right? And the main point in that field is that just because there's vagueness doesn't mean one can't actually show some precision, okay? And that's the point. And so, and all I'm saying, we don't have time now because we have to finish, is that there are ways of thinking about representation that actually, like Ida began to say, a sensor is not the same. You can begin to make distinctions, and they're there. All I would say is go read about them because they are out there, right?
No, of course, but I think what I'm proposing here is like maybe one way to draw that line that you want to draw, it comes at the behavioral level where if I am unable to perform a task because I'm using a shared representation, then I am allowed to call that a shared representation, for instance, right? Like if the visual information coming through my visual cortex, I can use for many different things. So maybe that's not a representation to you.
I would think
No,
those-
listen, and well, we'll have to have another conversation. No, I mean, I think that there's a useful, vague boundaries. Most interesting concepts in the world have fuzzy boundaries, but they have boundaries. Okay, and I think it's not useful. And this is Socrates' paradox in Greek philosophy. When does a grain of sand become a pile of sand? We don't say, oh, well, because there's a continuum and it's vague, we should just get rid of pile of sand and get rid of grain of sand because we can't find the line between them. So let's dispense with the difference between a pile of sand and absurd, right? So in other words, we have to live in a world where you can be vague and have a continuum, but nevertheless make useful distinctions between things.
I'm just
Okay, and I don't think
Hegel.
that's what I'm saying, all right? And I don't think representation should be equally true for a grain of sand and a pile of sand. It loses its usefulness, as far as I'm concerned.
I'm just going to invoke Hegel here with his analogy to a man who's taking out hairs from one by one from his head. At some point, it's a quantitative difference, and at some point, it becomes a qualitative difference when he becomes a bald man. But when is that sort of? That's not. It's almost like in our speak, it's like a Gaussian process. It's not like a clear moment. That it's like at this moment, after like how many hair that is pulled out, he's now a bald man. It's not exactly like that. So there is like a kind of a gradient around there, and some people might be more lenient towards like the end tail or the beginning tail. But I think that John, we need to also allow for that kind of a gradient, or that kind of like a kind of a little bit of a range within which the qualitative difference might happen. And I think the difference is that for you, that range goes very far. It goes into prefrontal cortex. For me, it's like, as long as it's not the sensor and it has some neurons, I'm good. So I think that might be where we draw the line when a man becomes bald, for instance. It's similar to that Hegel example. It's just, when do we think there is a qualitative difference from just a sensor?
These cases are very, very different from each other, actually. Like the case, I think these cases are very different. The Socrates paradox, like the vagueness of terms like baldness or tall or being athletic, like that seems like a very different question than the question that I took her to be asking.
Why is it like at which point does it become qualitatively? At which point does it become qualitatively a different thing? It's like the grain of sand thing. It's like
no, I don't think it's like that. I don't think it's like you're changing something along one dimension and then suddenly you're bald or not bald, or it's a pile or not a pile. I think Javier is asking a different question about when is the role qualitatively different, not just in a way where we're changing like one variable a little bit, or like changing the extent of one thing by degrees. There's actually something different happening when you're doing, say, mere transduction versus doing some kind of processing. At least I think that's the.
But there is.
Just to be clear, I was responding to what John was saying with regard, and I was comparing it to my notion of levels of representation. So I'm going from sensor versus different levels of representation. And I'm okay with calling a very wide range representation. And I'm saying qualitatively, there is a difference from a mirror and there's a difference from a sensor, but that's like gradient. In a gradient, it gets closer to the first level of representation. John says, I'm only going to call it a representation at level 42 and up, which in a neural network, it could be, let's say, the number of layers that you might have, or the complexity of your architecture before you're allowed to call something actually a representation. That's how I understand the difference between what I'm saying.
You're exactly right, and I just right. I think that is exactly what I'm saying. Now, whether the Socrates paradox is being used by me as a metaphor, because I'm not interested in the fact that it's just grains of sand that are being varied, Rosa. What I'm saying is that you can have similar neural architecture, you can use similar methods, you can look at neural connections and firing rates, just like you can count grains of sand. But at some point, there's a qualitative difference in the kind of representation being used for cognition compared to sensory motor. So Ida did characterize my position completely right. It is, you can say that the tissue is on a continuum, you can say that the methods are on a continuum, you can say what you like, but what I'm saying is the kind of representation being used is qualitatively distinct, is what I'm saying.
But it's qualitatively distinct, not just because it's more layers in. It's qualitatively distinct for reasons.
That's right.
Beyond just it's more layers in.
Yes.
But the architectural grounds for those reasons is like those reasons are supervening on the difference in architecture. That's how I see it as a physical.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, it's is it because prefrontal cortex has more neural to neural connections? It's 1 to 1,000, 1,000 into 1 versus 100 into 1 in motor cortex. Is it something to do with the configuration? Exactly right. There must be some implementational architectural feature that allows it to have those other reasons, of course. But and I think that when you do look at the, for example, William Ramsey, who gives a very nice description of different notions of representation, he's exactly right about these differences. And I think we should accept those, even though the implementational level is a continuum. But we've been that way. We've been there in physics before, right?
We're saying we have, Flowers, you want to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm listening to this conversation, and I think one of the things that we're leaving out is the domain specificity of the ways that we're using these terms, right? So, John asked the question, when does a person become an athlete, right? Within the domain of track and fields, somebody who's jogging for their health is not technically an athlete, right? Because that field, that domain, provides the architecture, provides the reasons for calling something an athlete, right? And insofar as neuroscience as a field is broad and has different ways of cashing these things out, some of these reasons will be borne out through the philosophically, the epistemological architecture of the chosen field. So it's not an arbitrary distinction of when a grain of sand becomes a pile of sand, and so on and so forth. It's a distinction supplied by the epistemological structures of the field, how we are doing our investigating, right? And if we have questions about the ways that the ways that we chop things up emerge from our epistemological assumptions, that's where we need to locate it, right? We need to ask about the methodologies, the epistemologies we're using to make these distinctions, and perhaps not so much about the distinctions themselves, right? So how you're getting to the distinction. And I think Ida's examples are really bearing this out insofar as she's doing the work to translate into an epistemological domain relative to the field, right? And so this is the kind of things that this is where this is how I, as a pragmatist, would suss this out, right? You're all looking at general features of a phenomena, but interpreting them different through the domain or through the epistemological lenses supplied by your given domains, which is why you can have different opinions about or different scientific positions about similar or the same phenomena.
But and it's actually interesting that Soroshi's paradox, Rosa, that in a podcast I was listening to earlier this year or last year, Sean Carroll asked Carl Friston when he was using his free energy principle. He said, I get your free energy principle, but it applies equally well to a bacterium as it does to the brain of my cat, as it does to a human. So what's the difference? And Carl said, what is the difference? And Carl, what Carl says? He goes,
No difference.
He says, no, he says he's very aware that it's very unsatisfactory because it's much more a homeostatic kind of argument than a cognitive one. And you know what he said? He goes, well, I've just heard about Soroshi's paradox. And it's just a continuum where suddenly, emergently, you become a cat and a human versus a bacterium. A total cop-out, right? In other words, attempting to be universal and then falling back on some sort of phase transition. And that's what we are talking about here, which is a more rich version of representation as you get closer to cognition versus being in the retina. And all of us have shoved that difference that I'm insisting on somewhere else. It's in the function, it's in the, you use it in terms of the contrast that you're particularly asking. But we're all, Ida talks about the architecture or, some other feature of the neural network, but we're all agreeing that we've got to shove the difference that makes a difference somewhere. So actually, underneath all this seeming disagreement, we are all kind of agreeing that there are differences that make differences. And all I'm saying is that we don't really have a theory of that difference as we move towards cognition. And I think that's what we're all going after. And it might not be right to put that in the representational bucket, that difference that makes a difference, but we have to put it somewhere.
Just a quick thought here. I think you're totally right, John, with this, but I do think that, I mean, at least just from the perspective of my advisor, Jonathan Cohen, I think what he refers to that you're calling representation, he calls canonical representation. And in the chat, I saw Ella pose a good sort of thought there, saying that perhaps representations need to exist beyond the realm of stimuli. So for instance, something like language or mathematics, those are representations that don't depend on any sort of stimulus, you know, like things like parity or magnitude, going back to those things. Those exist as theoretical entities that can be represented, well, that's poor use of that word, but that can be represented in the brain. And perhaps that is sort of the phase shift that you're looking for. The word used like in cognitive science is canonical representations for that.
That's level 42.
Sure. I mean, and Jonathan, you know, and I just watched John, you know, I've spoken to Jonathan about this, you know, in the end, you have to have some qualifier. Canonical is now the qualifier, but everyone realizes that there's some extra quality that we need to go after, and let's just accept it. And whatever that qualifier is, say canonical, fine, but we have one, and we all know it. And I think the reason, and I think the reason why we don't want to have qualifiers is we want to naturalize neuroscience, and by naturalizing neuroscience, we feel like we have to get rid of these distinctions. We can have neuroscience on a continuum and still have these distinctions. We don't have to sacrifice one for the other.
I think
before my vocal cords transform into a cat, I'm just gonna say, so John, not all of us think we need something extra or new for the word representation. I think the majority of us, what we are saying is that there is some methods and it works at different levels. I can go to a poster row and go from just neurons to population of neurons to manifolds to fMRI, and I don't get confused. I don't like, you know, pass out. Like, you know, it's like, I understand what's going on. I understand the continuity. I understand that this is all, for instance, has to do something with grid fields, and that's okay. Like, you know, and we understand the translation. Some people don't. I understand that some people don't also. But I'm just saying that there is a large number of us in the field that it's native to us to accept that or to understand representations at different levels. We grew up just with all of them all at once. I personally was in the prefrontal cortex when I started. That's my native region. That's my hometown. But like other people started from sensory regions or from neurons. And yeah, I'm just going to say that not everyone needs an extra notion for it.
Well, no, but the difference that makes a difference is happening in the word level for you. Right? They always find a place to put the difference. Now it's in level, but we always, isn't it interesting that we always find somewhere to put the difference in, right? And that's what I think is so interesting. Level, architecture, we always find a place. And what I'm asking, why do we have to have that?
That's how computational models work. Like, you know, you can do more things when you have a more complex architecture. You can do multitasks when you have a more complex, and you can't. I think we all.
But then we have to define complexity, and then we have to define complexity.
That sounds like a really good project for next.
All right.
Yeah. So John, I'm sorry. I just want to say, John, I found absolutely unconvincing this last train of thought that you're having, because like it's actually defined. The notions of like architecture or layers or everything. These are all very clear notions. So I'm just gonna. Clear. Yeah, I'm just going to like, you know, say that I'm not convinced by this end thing. But I just want to thank everyone, especially Claire and Bahar behind the scenes who you're not seeing right now. I want to thank everyone who stayed on screen so late in spite of many family kind of things. And I just want to see, are we going to have the next week for the recap? Because I want to invite everyone back in to come and recap all of our guests. And then we take it.
Next week, definitely recap. I'll try to rearrange my family vacation, but it will exist regardless of that.
We will understand if you miss parts of it or show up late. That's totally fine. Just like if you let us know, we will manage to sort of work around it so that your family is also getting enough of the vacation. It's not disrupted. Yeah. Anything else? Rosa, this was your session. Anything you'd like to sort of outro us with?
Good. Thank you again. Thank you so much for the discussion. It's really helpful.
Thank you. It was very much fun. And thank you guys for the questions.
It might be the record. I think this might be the record.
No, we've been before until 7:40 once.
Oh.
That was
okay.
the Tim
Well,
Barron's night.
almost.
All right.
Thanks,
Javier,
everybody.
the fact that we went,
See you next week.
and Javier, I blame you for going so long. Thanks, everybody.
It was very good
Bye.
question, Javier. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.